Something I only really worked out a few years ago is that when people say Lord of the Rings, they're talking about a very small corner of what Tolkien actually wrote. Most of it never got published while he was alive. It sat in boxes, in different handwriting, in about 6 contradictory versions, and his son spent the rest of his life sorting it out. So that's what tonight is. Not the plot of the films, the whole thing underneath it, where the world came from, who built it, why the elves are so sad about everything, what happened to the island that sank, and what everybody got up to afterwards. It wanders a bit. That's on purpose. Nothing here builds to anything, so you can drift off wherever you like, and you won't have missed a twist because there isn't one. If this is your sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere down there, and I'd appreciate it. That's the whole ask. Right, let's start about 7,000 years before anyone in the films is born, with a man marking exam papers in Oxford. The story everyone tells about Tolkien is that he was marking exam papers one summer, bored out of his mind, and found a page a student had left blank, and on that blank page he wrote, for no reason he could ever explain, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. He didn't know what a hobbit was. He said that himself repeatedly, whenever anyone asked. The word turned up first and the creature had to be worked out afterwards. I love that story, partly because it's true, and partly because it's the entire man in one sentence. Tolkien's whole career runs in that direction. The word comes first. The thing the word describes gets invented later, sometimes decades later, and usually in far more detail than anybody asked for. Because here's the bit that surprises people. He wasn't a novelist who happened to like languages. He was a philologist, a man whose actual paid job was the history of words, and the languages came first. Long before Bilbo, long before The Ring, before any of it, he was sitting in a room inventing a language for fun. He was an orphan, which matters more than people give it credit for. His father died when he was 4, out in South Africa, where he'd been born. His mother died when he was 12. He and his brother were handed over to a Catholic priest as guardian, and from then on the family he had was mostly the family he chose. He went up to Oxford, to Exeter College, and studied more or less everything with an old grammar attached to it. Classics, Old English, the Germanic languages, Gothic in particular, Welsh, and Finnish, which is the one that did the damage. Finnish did something to him. He described finding a Finnish grammar as being like stumbling into a wine cellar filled with bottles of an astonishing wine of a kind nobody had ever tasted. That's roughly how he talked about grammar books, which tells you what sort of person we're dealing with here. Out of that came Quenya, High Elven, the language you hear in the films whenever somebody wants to sound ancient and slightly disappointed in you. It's got Finnish bones, the sound of it, the way the endings stack up, and he built it as an undergraduate, essentially as a private hobby, in the way other people do crosswords. Welsh gave him the other one, Sindarin, and the origin of his Welsh obsession is genuinely one of my favourite details about him. As a small boy, he saw the names painted on the sides of coal trucks, Welsh place names, coming in on the railway from the valleys, and thought they were beautiful before he had the faintest idea what any of them meant. That's it. That's the seed, a child looking at goods wagons and thinking the words on them look lovely. Everything else grows out of that. Now here's the problem he ran into, and it's the problem that created Middle-earth. A language isn't a code. It's not a set of substitutions where you swap English words for prettier ones. A real language has history in it. It has words that got worn down over centuries, borrowings from neighbours, sounds that shifted because of something that happened 400 years ago. So if you want to invent a language properly, and Tolkien only ever wanted to do anything properly, you need speakers, you need the neighbours they borrowed from, you need the 400 years, and the thing that happened in it. He said it outright in a letter once. The stories were made to provide a world for the languages, rather than the other way round. That's not a modest little aside either, it's a straight description of the working method. I find that genuinely mad, and I mean that as a compliment. Most invented worlds start with a map or a hero. This one starts with a man deciding that his fictional language needed a plausible sound change, and reasoning outwards from there until he had a creation myth. Then the war happened. He finished his degree first. He delayed enlisting until 1915, which took some doing socially, because by then the pressure on young men to go was ferocious, and people noticed if you didn't. He got his degree, then joined the Lancashire Fusiliers as a second lieutenant and went out to the Western Front. He was at the Somme, signals officer, which meant runners and field telephones, and cable that never worked when it mattered. He lasted about 4 months before trench fever got him, which is a lice-borne thing, miserable but survivable. And in November 1916, he was shipped back to England to recover. The trench fever probably saved his life. That's a horrible thing to say about being ill, but the numbers back it up. Because of the small circle of school friends he'd been closest to, a little club they'd formed as teenagers, all of them convinced they were going to change English literature between them. Nearly all were killed. He came home to a group of friends that had essentially ceased to exist. He never wrote about the war directly. He was quite firm about that, and got a bit tetchy when people insisted the books were an allegory for it. But you can feel it in the shape of things. The Legendarium is not a triumphant body of work. It's mostly about loss that can't be reversed, and about ordinary people being asked to carry something they didn't sign up for, and about how the good outcome still involves everything beautiful going away. The thing he actually did with the war years was start writing. Not novels, myths. He filled notebooks with the earliest versions of what became the Silmarillion while he was convalescing and afterwards, and he kept at it, on and off, in the gaps between marking papers and raising 4 children for the rest of his life. 50-odd years. On a book he never finished. Then the blank page happened, and The Hobbit. The Hobbit came out in 1937 and did well enough that the publisher sensibly wanted more Hobbits. So Tolkien, being Tolkien, sent them the Silmarillion instead. A vast, solemn, unfinished mythology with no hobbits in it whatsoever, and a cast list of about 200 elves whose names all begin with F. They said no, politely I think, but definitively. So he went away and started a sequel about hobbits, which he assumed would take a year or so. It took roughly 12 years. The Lord of the Rings came out in the mid-50s in 3 volumes, mostly because paper was expensive, and nobody wanted to gamble on a single, enormous book by a professor of Anglo-Saxon. It's now sold well north of 150 million copies, which is one of those numbers that stops meaning anything the moment you look at it. And the funny part to me is that he didn't really want to write it. He wanted to publish the mythology. The Lord of the Rings was the thing his publisher would actually accept, and the mythology remained the private project, the one he kept returning to and rewriting and never landing. There's a detail I keep coming back to. He didn't just write the stories in English and call it a day. He built a translation conceit, the idea that the whole book is his rendering of an older text written by hobbits, in their own language, with all the names swapped into English equivalents, that would feel to us the way the originals felt to them. That's why the Hobbit names are homely, and the Rohan names sound Old English. It's not decoration, it's a working system, and he kept it consistent across 1,000 pages. Nobody asked for that. There's no reader on earth who needs it. He did it because leaving it undone would have annoyed him, which is, in the end, the reason all this exists to be talked about at 1 a.m. Somebody spent 60 years being annoyed by loose ends in a world he made up, and the byproduct is the most thoroughly furnished imaginary place anyone's ever built. But if you want to start where he'd have wanted you to start, you don't start with the Hobbit at all. You go back a good deal further than that, past the elves, past the making of the sun, to a point where there's nothing to describe yet, and something happens anyway. So, only Eru the One and the Ainur he made exist. That's harder to picture than it sounds, because your brain immediately supplies a black void with some stars in it, and there aren't any stars yet. There isn't any black. There's no room for the void to be in. There's just Eru, who is the one that was always there, and the word Tolkien uses for him more often is Ilúvatar, which means something close to Father of all. And the first thing that happens, the very first event in the history of everything, is that he thinks of some people, the Ainur, offspring of his thought, which is a lovely way of putting it, and each one of them understands a different portion of what's in his mind. One of them gets water, one gets air, one gets the way things grow, one gets craft and metal and stone, and none of them gets the whole picture, because the whole picture is only in him. Then he teaches them to sing. That's the creation. Not a word, not a hand moving over the water, not a big bang. A choir. He gives them themes and they sing them back to him, first alone, then in small groups, learning each other's parts, and eventually he calls them all together and gives them one great theme and tells them to make of it what they can. And the part I like about it is this. He tells them to add their own thoughts. He wants embellishment. He wants them to bring what they know into it. That's the instruction. Which makes what happens next slightly more complicated than good versus evil. Because the greatest of them, Melkor, who'd been given the largest share of gifts of any of them, starts weaving in ideas that came from his own head rather than from the theme. He'd been going off on his own for a long time by then, out into the empty places, looking for the flame that makes things real, and not finding it, because it wasn't out there. And what he wants is exactly what everyone else was told to do. He wants to add something of his own. He just wants it to be his rather than a contribution to somebody else's piece. That's the fall. Not a rebellion with banners, not a war. One musician deciding he'd rather be the composer. The discord spreads. The Ainur nearest him get thrown off. Some fall silent, some start copying him, and the whole thing starts to buckle. So Eru raises a second theme, quieter, deep and sweet, and Melkor's noise rises against it. And then a third, and this is the one that matters, because the third theme doesn't fight, it absorbs. Every loud, triumphant thing Melkor puts in gets taken up into the pattern and turned into part of the design. Not cancelled, used. And Melkor can hear that happening, which is what actually enrages him, because he's putting his whole self into breaking it. And the breaking keeps coming out sounding intentional. Then Eru stops the music and tells him plainly that no theme can be played that doesn't have its uttermost source in him, and that anyone attempting it only ends up as an instrument in devising things more wonderful than they'd imagined. Which is, on reflection, the most infuriating thing you could possibly say to someone. After that, he shows them what they've made. A vision, a whole world hanging there, with a history running through it. And the Ainur watch their own music turned into landscape and weather and living things. They see the shape of the seas they'd been singing. They see the coming of the children, elves and men, who none of them had invented and who came straight from Eru's own thought. And they fall in love with them on sight. And then he takes the vision away. Because the vision wasn't the world. It was a rehearsal, and he says the word, "Ear, let it be," and sends the fire out into the void, and the actual thing begins to exist somewhere they can't see. So a number of them go down into it to finish the job, and going in is a one-way trip, which I don't think gets said enough. Whoever enters the world is bound to it until the end of it. They can't leave. Their power gets tangled up with the physical stuff of the place. They're less like gods visiting and more like the world's permanent staff, and they can't hand in their notice. They arrive expecting the finished vision, and instead find something raw and unformed with no shape to it yet, and have to build the thing from memory of a song they only half heard. I don't know. There's something about that I find quietly devastating. Everyone in this story, right from the first page, is working from an incomplete memory of something beautiful. Now, a few practical consequences, because they matter for the next several thousand years. First, the world is flat. Flat with the seas laid out around it, and that stays true for an extremely long time. Keep that in your back pocket, because it changes later, and the change is spectacular. Second, and this is the load-bearing idea of the whole legendarium, everything that goes wrong is already in the score. The discord got woven in, which means that every disaster in this world has a strange double quality to it, where the awful thing happens, genuinely, and no one is spared, and yet somehow the awful thing ends up producing something that couldn't have existed otherwise. That's why the books are full of luck that doesn't quite feel like luck. Bilbo finding a ring in the dark, a hobbit turning up at exactly the wrong moment and it turning out to be the right one. Tolkien wasn't being sloppy with coincidence. He'd built a universe where coincidence is the third theme, still running underneath everything. He never has a character announce this. Nobody stands up and explains the mechanism. Gandalf gets closest when he says that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker, and then declines to say by whom. Third, and this one's just aesthetically pleasing, the world is made of music, so music does things in it that it shouldn't. When you get to characters winning fights by singing later on, that's not whimsy. That's a person reaching back to the thing the world is actually made out of. And there's one more consequence, which is Melkor. He goes down into the world too, and he goes down angry, and he brings the same appetite with him. He wants to own it. Not rule it particularly, own it, the way a child wants a toy nobody else has touched. He never really succeeds. That's worth saying now rather than later. Every single thing Melkor does in the entire history of the world is destructive or derivative, and Tolkien is quite deliberate about that. Melkor can ruin things, and he can corrupt things, but he can't make anything new, because making is the one part of the gift he didn't get. There's one more piece of this, and it's the one that explains why Tolkien bothered with any of it, so I'll put it here rather than leave it out. The thing Melkor went looking for out in the void and couldn't find is called the Flame Imperishable. It's what makes things real, as opposed to imagined, and it isn't a substance you can go and collect. It's with Eru, and that's the end of the matter. Everything the Ainur do afterwards is arrangement. They're extraordinarily good at arrangement, but not one of them can like that. And Tolkien, very obviously, thought that applied to him as well. He had a word for it, subcreation, and he put it in a poem written to C.S. Lewis at a point when Lewis had been dismissive about myths being lies. The line everyone quotes is that we make still by the law in which we're made, meaning that if the thing that made you makeys, then making is what you're for, and inventing worlds isn't a frivolity, it's the family business. Which means that Ainulin Dala isn't just a creation myth he needed for the front of the book. It's an argument about his own job, put into the mouths of angels, and it's the reason Owl gets forgiven later, and it's the reason the villain of the whole legendarium is specifically someone who wanted to be the author instead of a musician. I don't think you need to share a word of his religion to find that a rather lovely way to justify sitting up late making things up. Anyway, that's the sound. A choir, a sulk, and a piece of music that was made bigger by the person trying to wreck it. Now, let's talk about who actually turned up to build the place, and what they got wrong. Ulmo doesn't live with the others. That's my favourite fact about the Valar, and I'm putting it first because I don't think it gets said enough. The rest of them build a lovely place to live in the far west and settle down there together, and Ulmo, who is water, simply doesn't move in. He stays out in the deep sea. He rarely takes a body, he doesn't attend things, and when the others hold a council, he's usually just not there. And he turns out to be the most useful one of the lot. Because water goes everywhere. Every river running down into Middle-earth is his, and every stream feeding it, and every bit of rain. And so, while the rest of the Valar are sitting in the west having very long meetings about whether to intervene, Ulmo is quietly doing it anyway. Half the crucial moments in the First Age happen because somebody heard something in a river. There are 14 of them, roughly, depending on how you count and which draft you're reading. Tolkien fiddled with the list for decades, and they're the great ones out of the Ainu, the ones who went down into the world, with a much larger number of lesser spirits who came with them, called the Maya, who I'll come back to, because a couple of them turn out to matter enormously. I'm not going to read you the full register. It's the sort of thing that reads beautifully on a page and turns into homework out loud. Let me just take you round a few of them. Manwë is the king, air and wind and the high places, and he's the one Eru left in charge. He lives on the highest mountain in the world, with the eagles going in and out, and he hears everything the wind hears, which is most things. And he's got a flaw that costs everybody dearly. He's pure, genuinely, completely, without malice, and because of that he can't quite believe in it in other people. He keeps assuming that what looks like repentance is repentance. That's not a small character trait. That single feature of Manwë's temperament is responsible for more suffering in this world than almost anything else, and I'll get to why in a minute. Vard is his wife, and she's the stars. She's also the one that everybody actually prays to. If you've ever wondered why elves cry out to Elbereth in moments of terror, that's her, Elbereth Gilthoniel, Star Kindler. And there's a reason, it's her name, and not Manwë's, which I'll come to when the elves wake up. Melkor hates her most of all of them, incidentally. Hates her more than he hates the ones who fight him. There's something quite telling in that. Then Auli, smith, craftsman, the one who understands substance, the one who made the actual stuff of the world, the rock, the metals, the bones of it. He's brilliant and he's impatient and he loves making things a bit too much for his own good. He gets his own section later because he does something he absolutely shouldn't. His wife is Yavanna, who is everything that grows. She's the one who notices, quite early on, that a world full of gifted craftsmen is going to be a world where somebody eventually looks at a forest and sees timber. Hold that thought as well. And Mandos. Mandos runs the halls where the dead go, and he is not a comforting man. He doesn't do reassurance. He speaks rarely, and when he does, it's usually a judgment or a prophecy, and it's usually right, and it is almost never what anyone wanted to hear. There's a moment later on where he pronounces a doom on an entire people, and every single word of it comes true over the following 500 years, exactly as stated. And then there's Nienna, who I think is the strangest one, and the one I'd most want to sit with. She grieves, that's her whole function. She lives alone in the west, on the very edge of the world, looking out over the wall at the darkness beyond it, and she weeps for the marring of the world, for every wound Melkor put into it, and for everything that was lost when the lamps came down, and for everything that hasn't happened yet. Which sounds unbearable, and it isn't, because Tolkien is quite clear that her sorrow isn't the collapsing kind. Those who listen to her learn pity and endurance in hope. Her tears bring healing rather than despair, and her halls are somewhere people go and come away stronger than they went in. And here's the detail that pays off enormously later. One of the spirits who used to go and sit with Nienna and who learned pity from her was a Maya called a Lorin. That's Gandalf. Long before he had a name in any language you'd recognise, he was the one hanging about in the house of the mourner, learning to feel sorry for people, which explains rather a lot about how he behaves for the following few thousand years. And I'd say it's the single most useful qualification anyone in this story ever acquired. There's also Tulkas, who I'll mention briefly because he's the opposite of all of that. He came into the world late, after everyone else, specifically because he heard there was a fight on. He's got no weapons and no interest in any. He laughs constantly. He's not remotely clever. He holds no grudges and forgets injuries the moment they're over. And when the Valar need Melkor physically taken down, it's Tulkas who wrestles him. Every group has one. It's nice that the Pantheon does too. Right, so that's the staff, and their first attempt at lighting the place is the two lamps. They build two enormous pillars, one in the north, one in the south, and set lamps on top of them, and the light meets in the middle, where everything grows. It's not a bad system. It's very much a first draft. No seasons, no night. Just an even permanent glow, and everything is a bit rich and strange and overgrown under it. And Melkor knocks them over. He'd been quiet for a while, biding, and then he comes back and tears the pillars down, and the falling of the lamps wrecks the shape of the world. Lands break, seas rush in, mountains get thrown up. The whole geography they'd been working on for ages gets ruined in an afternoon. So they withdraw. They go west, over the sea, and build Valinor behind a wall of mountains, and that's the moment the Valar stop being the caretakers of the world and start being residents of a nice district in it. I do think Tolkien wants you to notice that, and in Valinor, Yavanna sings up the two trees. Now these are the most beautiful things in this entire mythology, and I want to do them properly. Two trees growing in a mound in the middle of the land. Telperion the elder, silver, his leaves dark green above and shining silver beneath, and dew falls from him that is stored as a kind of light. And Lorelin, gold, with young green leaves and flowers that hang in clusters like flames, and warmth coming off her. They alternate, each one waxes for 7 hours to full brightness, then wanes, and as one is fading, the other is coming up. So there are 2 moments in every day when both are shining at once and the light is silver and gold together. They counted time by it. That's what a day was, for ages and ages. There's no sun. That's the part people miss. There is no sun and no moon in the sky, and there won't be for a very long time. The world beyond the mountains lies under starlight, which is why the stars mattered so much to everyone who lived out there. And Valinor has its 2 trees, and that's the entire lighting situation for the world. And the best fact in all of this, the one I always come back to, is that the sun and the moon are salvage. They're not planned. The trees get destroyed later, and what the Valar manage to save from them is 1 last silver flower and 1 last golden fruit. And those 2 things get put into vessels and set sailing across the sky. The moon is a flower. The sun is a piece of fruit off a dead tree. The sky we've got is a repair job, done in grief with the last 2 things anyone could rescue. I find that a genuinely lovely bit of invention, and it's completely characteristic of him, because it means every sunrise in Middle-earth is a memorial. Anyway, Melkor. They eventually go and get him. There's a war, the Valar come out east, they take him in chains and they lock him up in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages, which is a very long stretch of time by any measure. And then they let him out. He asks for pardon, you see. He comes before them at the end of his sentence and he looks humbled and he says the right things. And Manwë, who cannot conceive of a lie of that size, believes him. Some of the others aren't so sure. Ulmo isn't convinced. Tulkas, who's the one who actually wrestled him down, wants nothing to do with it. But Manwë pardons him and lets him walk free in Valinor, and for a while he behaves beautifully. Helpful, full of good advice, especially good advice for anyone feeling a bit underappreciated. That decision unravels absolutely everything over the next several hundred years, and it's made by the kindest person in the story for the kindest possible reason. And all this while, the lamps, the trees, the war, the parole hearing, there's been nobody around to see any of it. No one to tell it to. That's about to change. Out east, by a lake, under stars. Picture a lake in the far east of the world, at night, and the night has been going on for thousands of years. The water's completely still. There's no wind to speak of. There's no moon, so there's no silver track across the surface. Just stars, very close and very bright, doubled in the water, so it's difficult to tell where the sky stops. And on the shore some people wake up. They'd been lying there asleep in the grass, and they open their eyes, and the first thing that has ever been seen by anyone in the history of the world is that. Stars on black water. Tolkien says the first thing they did was lie there for a long while just looking, and the first sound they made was speech. They started talking before they stood up. And the first word, in the earliest account of it, is a form of the verb to be. They looked at the sky and said, in effect, "Behold." That's why Vada gets the prayers. Not because of doctrine, not because she outranks anyone, but because when every elf who has ever lived thinks about the beginning, that's the image. The kindler of the stars made the first beautiful thing any of them ever saw, and 3 ages later, a hobbit in a tunnel full of spiders will shout her name without knowing why he knows it. They call the place Cuiv-Yanan, the Water of Awakening, and it doesn't exist anymore. The geography of the world got rearranged more than once after that, and by the time of the books, nobody can point to where it was. It's not on any map. It's just somewhere in the east, remembered. Now, the elves are found eventually, and the Valar have a decision to make, and I'm not sure they get it right. Melkor finds them first, actually, or at least his agents do, and there are dark rumours going around the elves before anyone friendly turns up. Some of them are taken, and what happens to those ones is a whole grim question I'll leave alone for tonight. But the effect is that the elves' first impression of the wider world is that there are riders out there in the dark who take people. So the Valar go to war again, wreck a good deal of the landscape doing it, chain Melkor up, and then have their meeting. And they decide the safest thing is to bring the elves west. Out of Middle-earth entirely, over the sea, to live in the light of the trees, where nothing can get at them. Not everybody agrees. Ulmo, predictably, thinks they should be left where they were put. To live in Middle-earth, under the stars, since that's where they woke and it's their own place. He loses the argument, and the summons goes out. And this is the moment the elves split into the peoples they'll be for the rest of history, because it's an invitation, not an order. And a great many of them say no, the ones who refuse outright, who stayed by the water and never went anywhere, get called the Avari, the unwilling, and they essentially drop out of the story. Tolkien never wrote much about them. They're just out there in the east, wild elves, occasionally glimpsed, and I think it's rather good that a chunk of his own creation stayed out of reach of him. The ones who set off make the great journey, which takes an enormous amount of time and covers the entire width of a continent, and the further they go, the more of them fall away. One group gets to the mountains, sees them, and simply doesn't fancy it. They turn aside and stay in the vales of the Anduin, and those are the ancestors of the Wood Elves. Which means, and this is one of those facts that reorganises things a bit, Legolas's people are the ones who never made the journey. Thranduil's Hall in Mirkwood is descended from a group who looked at a mountain range and thought, no thanks, we're all right here. Another group gets all the way to the shore, gets as far as the last coast, and falls in love with the sea and with shipbuilding, and can't bring themselves to leave it. Those are the Teleri, the mariners, who end up with a foot in both worlds. And then there's Thingol. Thingol was one of the 3 original leaders. He'd already been to Valinor as an ambassador. He'd seen the trees, he was leading his entire host west, and while they were passing through a wood in Beleriand, he heard a nightingale, went off to look, and met Melian. Melian is one of the Maya, one of the lesser spirits, and she'd been in that wood a long time teaching the birds to sing. And he took her hand, and they stood there looking at each other, and stars wheeled over them, and years went by. Actual years. His people went looking for him and couldn't find him, and eventually gave up and settled down where they were. So an entire kingdom exists. Doriath, the great hidden realm of the First Age, the one with the girdle of enchantment round it, because one bloke got distracted in a wood and didn't come back. I think about that a lot. It's an absurd origin for a superpower, and Tolkien plays it completely straight. His people become the Sindar, the Grey Elves, and they're the ones who stayed in Middle-earth and did rather well out of it. Sindarin is their language, and it's the one that ends up being spoken generally, because the ones who did go west, and then came back, found on their return that everyone had moved on linguistically, and it was easier to just switch. That's a real thing that happens to actual languages, and he built it into the story on purpose. The ones who did complete the journey and did cross the sea are where most of the drama comes from. The Noldor especially, the craftsmen, the scholars, the ones who make things, because they get to live in the light of the trees and learn from Auli himself and become extraordinarily accomplished and, in a couple of cases, extraordinarily difficult. Which brings me to the thing I need to explain properly now. Once, because everything else in this legendarium leans on it. Elves don't die, not of age at any rate. They can be killed and they can fade from grief, but the years don't take them. And they're bound to the world, permanently, the same way the Valar are. If an elf is killed, they go to the halls of Mandos and they wait, and in some cases, they come back. But out of the world they cannot go. They're in it until it ends. So an elf accumulates. Every place they've lived, everyone they've lost, every version of the landscape before it got rearranged, all of it's still in there, and there's no exit and no forgetting. Men are the other way. Men die, and when they die, they go somewhere else, somewhere outside the world entirely. And here's the part that gets me. The Valar don't know where. Eru didn't tell them. It's not in the music. Mandos, who knows more or less everything, does not know what happens to a human being after death. And Tolkien calls this the gift. That's his actual term. The gift of men. Death is the present Eru gave to humans and withheld from the elves. Now, I'll be honest, the first time I read that properly, I found it quite hard to take. It reads like a consolation prize dressed up in nice language. But the more of the legendarium you go through, the more you see what he's driving at, because the elves are exhausted. They're tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. They watch everything they build get worn down, and they cannot stop it, and they cannot leave. And the men who envy the elves their immortality, and there are men who do, and one lot in particular gets very serious about it, those are the ones who end up destroying themselves. Anyway, of the elves who did go west, into the light, there's one family who caused more trouble in the following few thousand years than every enemy put together. And it starts with 3 stones. They're not big. That's the first thing worth saying about them, because people imagine something the size of a football, and they're not. They're jewels, made to be worn, 3 of them, and they look like crystal until you look properly. And what's in them is light. Actual light off the 2 trees, both of them mixed, caught and held, and living inside the stone, so the things glow with their own inner fire in the dark. They're warm to hold, and they're hallowed, which in this world has a practical meaning rather than a ceremonial one. Anything evil that touches them gets burned. Nobody has ever managed to work out how they were made. The person who made them wouldn't say, and then he died, and that was that. They can't be remade. That's important. There's exactly one attempt at this craft in the history of the world, and it went in the bin with him. His name was Feanor, and he was, by a distance, the most gifted person who ever lived. And I would not have wanted to be in a room with him. He's the eldest son of the Noldor king. His mother died giving birth to him, not physically exactly, more that she spent herself entirely making him, and had nothing left, and went to the halls of Mandos and refused to come back, which is its own quiet horror. Her name meant something like Jewel Daughter, and Feanor means Spirit of Fire, and between those 2 names, you've got the whole man. He invented the Tengwa script, the proper version of it, the alphabet they all use afterwards. He made gems that were better than the ones the earth produced. He built the Palantiri, the seeing stones, which turn up thousands of years later, still working and still causing havoc. Everything he touched came out better than it had any right to be. And he was proud and suspicious and quick to anger, and he had the specific flaw of a person who's never once been wrong about a technical matter, and has therefore concluded he isn't wrong about anything else either. Melkor, freshly pardoned, walking about Valinor being helpful, took one look at that and got to work. He didn't tell Feanor lies exactly. He told him things that were mostly true, arranged badly, that the Valar had brought the elves west to keep them controlled, that men were coming and would be given Middle-earth, and the Noldor would be left in a gilded cage. that Feanor's half-brothers were being favoured, that they wanted his place, that the Valar wanted his jewels. And it worked, because the poison went in exactly where the man was already sore. Feanor ends up drawing a sword on his own brother, which gets him banished from the city for 12 years. He goes off to a fortress in the north with his 7 sons and the Silmarils in a locked vault, and he starts refusing to show them to anyone. That's the moment that always strikes me as the real fall. Not the sword, the locking up. He made the most beautiful things in the world and then decided nobody was allowed to look at them. Yavanna asks for them at one point, and I'll get to why in a second, and he says no. He says that if he had to break them, he'd be broken himself, and that he'd rather die than give them up. And Mando, standing there, says quietly that he is not the first to say that, because Melkor's already been to the trees. He'd left Valinor, gone south into a region nobody visits, and made a deal with a creature called Ungoliant. She's a spider, roughly. She's more than that, and Tolkien is deliberately vague about where she came from. A thing in spider shape that eats light and turns it into a darkness you can't see through. And she's always hungry, and even Melkor is a bit frightened of her. They come to the trees during a festival, when everyone's away, and he strikes them, and she drinks them dry. And that's it. 2 trees that had been the light of the world since before anyone was born, and there's nothing left but 2 dead things standing in the dark. And in the dark, the Valar come to Feanor and ask for the Silmarils, because the light inside them could be used to bring the trees back. It's the only surviving sample, and he stands there, and he refuses, and then a messenger arrives from the north to say that Melkor has broken into the vault, killed Feanor's father, and taken the jewels. The whole thing is monstrous, and it's also perfect, in a horrible way. The Valar asked and he said no. The theft had already happened while he was saying it. He gives Melkor a new name that night. Morgoth, the Black Enemy. And it sticks. Nobody calls him Melkor again. And then he swears the oath. He gets up in front of the crowd in the dark and swears, by the name of Ilúvatar himself, that he and his 7 sons will pursue with vengeance and hatred anyone at all, Vala, elf, man, anything unborn, who takes or keeps a Silmaril from them, anyone who withholds one. That's the wording, and it's the wording that ruins everything, because it doesn't say enemies, it says anyone. 7 sons swear it with him. And an oath sworn on that name cannot be released and cannot be forgotten, and it stays alive for the next 600 years, while the people bound to it slowly discover what they've agreed to. Then they leave. The Noldor march out of Valinor to make war on Morgoth in the north, against the advice of everyone, and to do it they need ships. The Teleri have the ships, the mariners, the ones who fell in love with the sea. Their kin, they say no, politely and then firmly, because they don't want any part of it. So Feanor's people take them by force, and there's fighting on the quays at Alqualonda, and elves kill elves for the first time in history. That's the first kinslaying. It's a small ugly fight in a harbour over boats, and it poisons everything that comes after it. When they get to the far shore, some of them are so committed and so ashamed that they burn the ships rather than send them back for the others, and their own relatives are left to cross on foot over the ice in the far north, and people die doing it. Mandos meets them on the road out and delivers the doom. Tears unnumbered, that they'll be betrayed, that their houses will fall, that everything they begin well will go awry, that the oath will drive them and cheat them. And it all comes true, item by item, over the following centuries. I'm not going to take you through the whole First Age tonight. It's 500 years of war in a country called Beleriand that isn't there anymore. And it's mostly a long defeat, with a handful of astonishing moments in it. There's a hidden city. There's a siege that lasts 400 years and then breaks in one night. There's a story about a cursed man and his sister that is the single bleakest thing Tolkien ever wrote, and that one, honestly, deserves its own video, which I'm planning, because trying to do it in 5 minutes here would be a disservice. But I can tell you where the jewels end up, because it's oddly tidy. One goes into the sky, A mariner called Eärendil sails west with it bound on his brow, gets through to Valinor, and asks the Valar to intervene, and they do, finally, and Morgoth is thrown down, and Beleriand is broken and drowned in the process. Eärendil doesn't get to come home. He's set sailing through the heavens with the jewel, and that's the brightest star in the sky ever afterwards. One goes into the sea, one goes into the earth, down a fissure, carried by a son of Feanor, who'd finally understood what he'd sworn. Sky, sea and stone. Nobody's ever getting any of them back. And here's the detail I love. Thousands of years later, in a tunnel in the mountains, a hobbit holds up a small glass phial, and it lights up and drives off something very old and very hungry. That's light from the star, which is light from the jewel, which is light off a tree that died before the sun existed. The oldest thing in the world, still working, in the hands of somebody who hasn't the faintest idea what he's holding. Out of all that ruin, though, there's one story Tolkien cared about more than any of the rest, and he cared about it for reasons that had nothing to do with elves. There's a cemetery in North Oxford called Wolvercote. It's a working suburban graveyard, nothing grand about it, and there's a little sign with an arrow on it because otherwise people wander around for 20 minutes looking. The stone is grey granite and quite plain. 4 names on it: Edith Mary Tolkien, who died in 1971, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, who died 2 years later in 1973, and under each name, a second name. Under hers, Luthien. Under his, Beren. He asked for that. After she died, he wrote to his son Christopher about it, and he was very specific. She was Luthien, and the reason she was Luthien went back to a wood in Yorkshire in 1917. So let me do that bit first, because the story only really lands if you've got the real one underneath it. He was 25. He'd come back from the Somme with trench fever a few months earlier, and he was in and out of hospital and convalescent camps for most of the following year, and Edith had followed him around the country to be near wherever he was posted. They'd been married for about a year at that point, after being kept apart for 3 by his guardian, who'd forbidden all contact until he turned 21, and who he'd obeyed to the letter and then written to her on the actual eve of his 21st birthday. She was engaged to somebody else by then. She broke it off. And that summer, in a wood near a village called Roos in East Yorkshire, in a glade full of hemlock in flower, so white, waist high, the whole floor of the wood white with it, she danced for him. That's the whole event. A young woman dancing among white flowers for a soldier who'd recently watched most of his friends die. He started writing the story that same summer, in hospital, in a notebook. And he came back to it and rewrote it more times than anything else he ever touched. Prose versions, verse versions, versions, abandoned halfway. He was still fiddling with it in his 70s. In the letter to Christopher in 1972, 55 years later, the year after Edith's death, he was still describing that glade. Right. So the story, Beren is a man, human, mortal, and by the time we meet him, he's the last of his band. Everyone he fought beside is dead. He's been living rough in the wilderness as an outlaw for 4 years with a price on his head, and he's fairly far gone. He crosses the mountains and comes down into Doriath, into Thingol's hidden kingdom that exists because a bloke got distracted in a wood, and he's exhausted and grey and half feral. And he comes through the trees at evening, under a rising moon, and there's a woman dancing on the grass beside a river. That's Luthien, daughter of Thingol and Melian, half-elf, half one of the Maiar, and the fairest thing that ever came into the world, which Tolkien states flatly and never qualifies. And Beren stands there, and every memory of pain goes out of his head, which is a phrase that sounds like a stock romantic line, until you remember who was writing it and what he'd been through the previous winter. She vanishes. He spends a year wandering that wood looking for her, unable to speak, and he names her Tinuviel, Nightingale, before he knows any other name for her. And then in the spring she comes back and takes his hand. Now her father is a king with a girdle of enchantment round his borders and an extremely high opinion of his own house. And a mortal man turning up in it is not what he had planned. But he's given his word to hear the man, so he can't just kill him. So he sets a price instead. A bride price, formally, which is a real thing in the old northern literature Tolkien lived in. He asks for a Silmaril out of the Iron Crown of Morgoth. He's joking. That's the thing people miss. It's a cruel joke, an impossible demand designed to send the man off to die somewhere else, so that no blood's on Thingol's hands. Melian, standing beside him, tells him immediately that he's just doomed either his daughter or himself, and probably both, and he doesn't listen. Beren laughs and says he'll go. What follows is a proper quest, and it's got everything. It's got Finrod, an elf king who owes Beren's father a debt, and honours it, even though it costs him his crown, and eventually his life. There's a duel of songs, an actual sung magical duel between Finrod and Sauron, who at this point in history is not the Dark Lord yet. He's Morgoth's lieutenant running a tower, and Finrod loses it, and they're all thrown in a pit. There's Huan, who is the greatest hound that ever lived, a wolfhound out of Valinor, and it's fated that he'll only speak 3 times before his death. He uses all 3, and one of them is essentially advice, and I find the fact that Tolkien rationed a dog's dialogue to 3 occasions absolutely delightful. Luthien, meanwhile, has been locked in a house in a tree by her own father to stop her going. She grows her hair out, weaves a cloak of shadow and sleep from it, sings her guards unconscious, and leaves. She then takes Sauron's tower off him, throws him out of it in a straight contest, which is worth remembering the next time somebody describes her as a love interest. And when they finally get into Morgoth's fortress, right down in the deep hall, in front of the throne, it's Luthien who does it. She sings and the entire court goes under. Morgoth himself falls out of his chair, and the iron crown rolls off his head, and Beren cuts one Silmaril out of it with a knife. Then he gets greedy and goes for a second one, and the knife snaps, and a fragment of it hits Morgoth in the face, and the whole place wakes up. They get out with one jewel, and a wolf at the gate bites off Beren's hand, with the Silmaril still in it. I always find the ending hard to talk about without slowing right down, so I'll just tell it plainly. They get home, the wolf is hunted, Beren dies in the hunt, of his wounds, with the jewel recovered, and his last act is to put it into Thingol's hand and say the quest is achieved. And Luthien lies down and dies of grief, which elves can do. That's a real mechanism in this world, not a figure of speech, and she goes to the halls of Mandos, where the dead elves wait, and she stands in front of the one being in creation, who does not do mercy, and she sings. She sings the 2 griefs together, the sorrow of the elves and the sorrow of men, woven into one song, and it's the most sorrowful thing ever put into words. And Mandos, who has never been moved by anything, ever, is moved. He goes to Manwë. Manwë consults Eru, and what comes back is a choice, and it's not a nice one. She can go to Valinor and live there in bliss, immortal, without Beren, because Beren is human and has gone wherever humans go and cannot be fetched back. Or she can return to Middle-earth with him as a mortal woman and live a second life, and die again properly and for good, and leave the world with him, going wherever it is that men go, and no one, not even the Valar, knows where that is. She takes the second one. That's the choice, and that's why the name is on the gravestone. Tolkien wasn't putting a fantasy character on his wife's headstone as a compliment about her looks. He was saying something about somebody who chose a mortal life with a specific man over anything else available to her, and about the fact that he'd had to sit in a hospital in 1917 and then again in 1971, and know that the arrangement ends. The story got its own book eventually. Christopher Tolkien put together all the versions, side by side, with the bits that changed shown as they changed, and published it in 2017. 100 years, almost to the summer, after the wood at Roos. He was 92 when he did it, and he described it as a memorial to his parents, which it plainly is. Anyway, since we're on the subject of making things you weren't strictly supposed to make, there's a rather good story about somebody who got caught doing exactly that. Owly is in a hall under a mountain working, and he's got 7 small figures on the bench in front of him, and he's just realised there's someone speaking to him. That's the scene. It's about a page long in the published text, and it's one of the best things in the whole book. What he'd done was this. He knew the children were coming, elves and men, sleeping somewhere in the design, due to wake at a time that had already been fixed, and he couldn't wait. He wanted somebody to teach. He wanted people who'd love the same things he loved, rock and metal and the making of things, and he was impatient, and impatience is his whole character. So he made some, in secret, out of the substance of the earth, in a hall under the mountains where nobody would look. And because he'd never seen an elf or a man, he had to guess what people ought to look like. He made them short and hard and tough because that's what he understood. The world at that point was full of Morgoth's mischief, and he built them to survive it. Stone-hard, stubborn, not easily moved by anything. Then Eru speaks to him. And the question he asks is devastating, because it's not angry. He asks why Owly's attempting something he knows is beyond his power and authority, given that he only has what was lent to him. And the specific point, the one that lands, is that these creatures can only do what Owl himself is thinking at them. They can't act. When he's thinking about something else, they stand there empty, which is true. He hadn't given them life. He couldn't. That part isn't in his gift. And Ola doesn't argue. He weeps, and he says the thing that saves him, which is essentially, the desire to make came from you. I did it because you made me love making. And then he picks up a hammer to destroy the 7 figures himself, because he'd rather do it than have somebody else do it. And they flinch. They see the hammer coming and they cower and they beg, which he never gave them the capacity to do because he'd never thought of it. And there's the proof. Eru had accepted them while Awala was still talking, and given them the flame, and they were real before the hammer came down. I think that's the most quietly beautiful thing in the Legendarium. The evidence that they're alive is that they're frightened. There's a condition though. They can't come first. The elves were the design, and the design doesn't move. So the 7 fathers of the dwarves get put back to sleep under the mountains in separate places, and they lie there until long after the elves have woken and made their journey. And this is the origin of a grudge that lasts about 7,000 years. Because from the dwarvish side, they were made first and made to wait. From the elvish side, the dwarves are a rough draft that got permission after the fact. Neither of them says it out loud in polite company, but it's absolutely there, sitting under every conversation those 2 peoples ever have, right down to a dwarf and an elf, being told they'll have to work together on a walk south, and both of them being visibly appalled about it. Yavanna, meanwhile, hears what he's done and goes straight to the point, that his children will love the things they make out of wood and stone, and will have no patience for the things that grow, and she wants something in the world that can answer back on behalf of the trees, which is where the Ents come from. But I'll come back to them because they deserve a proper go later on. Right, some practicalities. There are 7 fathers and 7 houses descended from them, and the one everything in the books revolves around is Durin's. Durin the Deathless, the eldest of the 7, who woke alone in the north and went wandering and came to a lake in a valley called the Mirrormere, and looked into it and saw a crown of stars round his own reflected head in the middle of the day when there were no stars in the sky. He took that as a sign, and he was right, and he dug in there, and what he made became Khazad Dûm. Now Khazad Dûm, we know it as Moria, which is a Sindarin word meaning black chasm, and it's a name given later by people who are frightened of it. Its real name means dwarf mansion, and for most of its existence, it was not a horror. It was the greatest work of any people in the history of the world. It's not a mine that got big. It's a city, cut down through the entire route of a mountain range, from the eastern valley to the western gate. Halls and stairs and shafts and pillared chambers going down for miles with lamps and running water and gardens under the mountain, worked over the course of thousands of years, by generation after generation of people who had all the time in the world and nowhere better to be. And what made it rich is mithril, silver grey, doesn't tarnish, light as a feather, and harder than steel, and in Middle-earth it was found only beneath Khazad-dûm, under that mountain. That's the whole basis of the greatest dwarf city there ever was, one seam of one metal that occurred nowhere else. And that's also what killed it, because the seam runs out at one end and you follow it, and they followed it down, and they dug too deep and they woke something that had been sleeping there since the First Age. A Balrog, which is one of Morgoth's people, and I'll leave what a Balrog is at that, because they're better vague. They lost the city in a year and 2 kings, and afterwards, wherever they went, that's the thing they wanted back, not treasure, the house. Balin's expedition is what happens when that longing gets the better of good sense. He takes a colony back in, a proper one, with a lord and a book and a plan, and they hold the place for about 5 years before it goes silent. When the fellowship walks through, that's what they find. A chamber with a tomb in it, and a battered book that stops mid-sentence. And the name on that tomb, incidentally, is not the man's real name. This is one of my favourite pieces of dwarvish world building. Their language, Khuzdul, is a secret. Genuinely secret. They don't teach it, they don't write it where others can see, and they conduct all their business with other peoples in whatever the local tongue is. And the names we know them by, Balin, Thorin, Glowin, all of them, are outer names, taken from the language of men, used in public. Their true names, their real dwarvish names, are never told to anyone outside their own people. Not in life and not on a tombstone. They don't even put them on their graves, so every dwarf you've ever heard of is going under an alias, forever, including in death. There's something enormously dignified about that, and also a bit sad. The women are the other closely guarded thing. Dwarf women are about 1/3 of the population. They very rarely travel, and when they do, they go dressed the same, and voiced the same, and bearded the same as the men, so nobody outside can tell. Which is why other peoples came up with the theory that dwarves aren't born at all, and simply grow out of stone. Tolkien, being who he was, worked out the rest of it too. Most dwarves never marry, they're absorbed in their craft and simply don't get round to it, and the ones who do usually only ever want one particular person, and if that doesn't happen, that's that. Which is why there are never very many of them, and why they lose ground century by century. And on the reincarnation thing, because it's odd and rather lovely, the dwarves believe Durin comes back. Not metaphorically, that the same person is reborn into the line, again and again, and there have been 6 of him so far, and the 7th is expected. The elves think this is nonsense. Tolkien wrote it down without ruling either way, which is very much his habit. He also said in an interview once that the dwarves put him in mind of the Jews, a people in dispersion, with their own private language, kept alongside the local one, still speaking of a home they were driven out of. He built Khuzdul with Semitic bones for exactly that reason. It's not a throwaway resemblance, it's a deliberate design. Anyway, that's making something you weren't cleared to make and getting away with it because you cried at the right moment. There's another version of that story, on a much bigger scale, and it involves an entire island being handed to people as a reward, with one condition attached. There's one rule: sail west, but only so far as Numenor stays in sight. You've been given the best ships and the best harbours, and the finest mariners the world will ever produce, and the sea is yours. And you may go out until the land behind you drops below the horizon, but not so far that you lose sight of Numenor. And you may not set foot on the shores of the Undying Lands. That's it. That's the entire condition. It's called the Ban of the Vala, and it gets referred to for the next 3,000 years by people who resent it more, with every generation. And you have to admit it's a slightly maddening rule, because you can see the place, on a clear day, from the top of the mountain in the middle of the island, on the clearest days. The far-sighted among them claimed they could make out the white tower of a harbour in the west. It's right there, and they're told they can go anywhere in the world except that. So let me back up and explain how they got the island in the first place. At the end of the First Age, when the Valar finally came and threw Morgoth down, and the whole of Beleriand broke and sank, there were 3 houses of men who'd fought on the right side the whole way through. They'd come west generations earlier. They'd allied with the elves. They'd fought and died in a war that was never really theirs, and a great many of them had nothing left. So they were given a reward. An island was raised out of the sea, star-shaped in the middle of the Western Ocean, closer to the Undying Lands than any other land, though not close enough to touch. And the men who'd been faithful were led there by the light of a star, and given the place, and given something else as well. Long life, 3 times the normal span, roughly, and health with it, and the ability to give up their lives voluntarily when they were done, rather than being worn down into decrepitude. They didn't get immortality, but they got so much of it that the difference started to feel like a technicality, and for a very long time, it was glorious. Genuinely. They became the finest sailors there had ever been, and they went everywhere, east to the shores of Middle-earth where they taught the men there farming and building and language, north and south along the coasts, out into oceans nobody had mapped. Every direction except the one direction. They built harbours and libraries and a tower and a road to the mountaintop, where they went 3 times a year to give thanks. They were tall, they were long-lived, they were kind to the people they met. The elves visited and brought them gifts, including a white tree, a seedling out of the west which they planted in the king's court. And if you know the tree in Gondor that everybody's staring at in the films, that's a descendant of that one. And it went sour extremely slowly, which is the horrible part. It starts with something completely reasonable. They didn't want to die. They'd been given 300 years and the elves had been given all of it. And every time an elf visited, that difference sat there in the room. And what began as gratitude turned into comparison, and comparison turned into grievance. Why the ban? Why can't we go west where nobody dies? What did we do wrong? And of course they've got it backwards, and the Valar tell them so directly through a messenger. The land isn't what makes the elves deathless, it's the other way round. Deathless people live there, and if a mortal man walked ashore in Valinor, he wouldn't become immortal. He'd just be a mortal man in a place too bright for him, and he'd burn out faster, not slower. Nobody believes it. Why would you? It sounds exactly like what you'd say if you were guarding something. So the tombs get bigger. That's the tell, and it's a wonderful bit of writing. You can chart the decline of Numenor by its funerary architecture. Early on, they simply gave up their lives when they were ready, laid down and let go, and the whole thing was considered rather graceful. Later, kings cling on into senility, and the burials get more elaborate, and they start embalming, and eventually half the wealth of the island is going into stone houses for dead people. And out east, the visits change. They'd arrived as teachers, and they come back as landlords. They start building fortresses instead of harbours. They start demanding tribute. There's a lovely awful line about how the men of Middle-earth used to run down to the shore to greet the ships, and later on, they ran away from them. Then Sauron, because Sauron survived the First Age. He'd been Morgoth's lieutenant, he'd lost his tower to Luthien, and after his master was chained and thrown out of the world, he went to ground for a long time and then set himself up in Middle-earth as a king and started calling himself Lord of the Earth. And the king of Numenor at the time, Ar-Pharazôn, who'd taken the throne slightly improperly and had a great deal to prove, heard about the title and took it personally. So he sailed east with an army so enormous that the world hadn't seen anything like it, and landed and demanded Sauron come out and do homage, and Sauron came out and did homage. Immediately, knelt down, surrendered, went quietly, and allowed himself to be taken back to Numenor as a hostage. That's the trick. That's the whole method, and I want to state it plainly here because it repeats. Sauron never wins by force when he can get in the front door instead. He arrives as a prisoner, or an advisor, or a guest bearing gifts, and he is unfailingly useful and unfailingly correct about small things. And by the time anyone notices he's the one setting the agenda, it's been 50 years and he's got the ear of the king. Which is exactly what happens. Within a few years, he's the king's chief counselor. Within a few more, he's running the state religion, and there is now a state religion, and it isn't about Eru. They cut down the white tree, they build a temple with a silver dome, and they burn things in it. And eventually, the things they burn are people, mostly people who'd stayed loyal to the old ways. Those loyal ones are called the faithful, and they get pushed to the edges of the island and watched. And the promise Sauron makes, the one the whole con is built on, is the obvious one. That Eru is a fiction invented by the Valar to keep men obedient. That the true Lord of the Dark will give them everlasting life. And that the ban is exactly what they always suspected it was, a fence round something that should be theirs. So when Ar-Pharazôn is old and frightened and can feel it coming, he builds the great armament. It takes years. It's the largest fleet ever assembled, and the sails cover the sea, and he sails west to take immortality by force from people who cannot be killed. They land. That's the part I always stall on. They actually land, and they walk up the shore, and nothing stops them. And the Valar do the only thing left to them. They lay down their authority and hand the matter to Eru. And Eru intervenes directly, for the first time since the music. The land opens. The fleet goes down into a chasm in the sea. The king and his soldiers, who'd stepped ashore, are buried under falling hills, and, in Tolkien's version, are still there, still alive, sealed in the caves until the end of the world. And Númenor itself, the whole island, the harbours, the libraries, the tower, everyone on it, goes under the water in a single day. And the world is changed. This is where the flat world I mentioned earlier stops being flat. The undying lands are taken out of reach entirely, removed from the circles of the world, and the earth is bent into a globe, so that from now on, a ship sailing west simply comes round to the east again. Only the elves are left a way through, a straight road that goes on west while the sea curves down under it, and only their ships can find it. That's an enormous thing to do to a fantasy setting. He took his flat mythological world and turned it into ours, deliberately, in the middle of the story, and made the loss of the flat world a part of the tragedy. 9 ships get out, the faithful warned in time, under a man called Elendil, and his sons Isildur and Anarion, and they're carried east on the storm and wrecked ashore in Middle-earth, which means the kingdoms of men in the Lord of the Rings, Gondor and Arnor in the north, are refugee states founded by survivors of a drowned country. And Aragorn, whose whole storyline is about a returning king, is the descendant of people who ran. One last thing, and it's the detail I find hardest to shake. Tolkien had a recurring dream, all his life, from childhood. A great wave, green and towering, coming in over the trees and the fields, and it terrified him. He called it his Atlantis complex, quite matter-of-factly, and he said he wrote The Fall of Númenor partly to be rid of it. And then his son Michael, who he'd never told about it, started having the same dream. He gave the dream to a character in the end. There's a man in the story who dreams of the dark wave coming over the land, over and over, and can't explain it. Anyway, while all that was going on out on the island, something a great deal quieter had been happening back on the mainland in a workshop with a very polite visitor. The workshop is in a country called Eregion, which is on the western side of the Misty Mountains, more or less next door to Khazad-dûm. That location is not an accident. The elves who settled there did it specifically to be near the dwarves, because they wanted the mithril and they wanted the collaboration. And for a while, this is the only period in recorded history where it happens, elves and dwarves genuinely got on. There was traffic through the gates both ways. The west door of the mines was made jointly by a dwarf and an elf, which is why it's got a dwarvish design on it and an elvish inscription, and why it opens on a password in a language neither people spoke natively. The elf who ran the workshop was Celebrimbor, and he was Fëanor's grandson, which tells you a fair bit before he's done anything. That family again, still making objects of impossible quality, still not quite thinking through the consequences. He'd broken with his father and his uncles over the oath, for what it's worth. He was by all accounts a decent man. He was just extremely good at his job and rather keen to be better. And then a visitor turns up. He calls himself Anatar, which means Lord of Gifts, and he's beautiful, and he's courteous, and he says he's an emissary of the Vala sent to help. Gil-galad, who's the High King of the Elves at the time, doesn't buy it for a second and won't let him in. Elrond doesn't buy it either, but Celebrimbor, whose whole life is craft, is being offered instruction by somebody who plainly knows things he doesn't. And that's the hook, and it's a completely honest hook, because the teaching is real. Anatar isn't lying about what he can do. He genuinely makes them better at their work. Everything the smiths of Eregion produce in that period is finer than anything they'd made before. What he was selling them, underneath the technique, was preservation. And I want to do this properly, because I think it's the single most misunderstood thing about the rings. They are not weapons. Nobody makes a ring to blow anything up. What the elves wanted, what they'd wanted, since they first stayed behind in Middle-earth instead of going west, was to stop things changing, to hold a place exactly as it was, to keep a wood from being cut, and a hall from crumbling, and a people from dwindling, and to have a corner of the mortal world that behaved like the immortal one. That's the temptation, and it's aimed with absolute precision at people who cannot die and therefore have to watch everything else do it. So they make rings, lots of them, over a long stretch of years, lesser ones first, as practice, essays in the craft, and then 16 that matter, made with Anatar's help. The 3, though, are made by Celebrimbor alone. Sauron never touched them and never even saw them, and Celebrimbor made them last and kept them quiet, which turns out to be the one piece of good judgment that saves the whole thing from being a complete rout. And then Sauron goes home to Mordor and makes one more. He makes it in the fire of the mountain, and he pours a very great part of his own power and will into it, which is the thing everybody skips over. The reason the One Ring works is that there's a substantial chunk of him inside it, permanently, and he never gets it back out. And the instant he puts it on and speaks the words that bind the others to it, every elf wearing one of the 3 knows. They just know. Straight away, all at once, they hear him in their heads, and they understand precisely what has happened and who's been staying in the guest room for the last 100 years. And they take the rings off, and they hide them, and the entire project collapses in a single moment of horrified clarity. Sauron's reaction to being rumbled is a war. He comes into Eregion and destroys it, kills Celebrimbor, and takes the 9 and the 7, though he never gets the 3. And that's essentially the end of the Golden Age. The dwarves shut their west gate. Elrond and many elves who survived went off and founded Rivendell as a refuge, which is what Rivendell actually is, a place people ran to during a war and then long remained. So what did the rings do? The 3 went to the elves, and the elves used them exactly as intended. And this is the bit I think is genuinely lovely. Rivendell and Lothlorien are ring work. That sense you get in both places, that time is running differently, that nothing here is falling apart, that it's the same afternoon it was 400 years ago. That's a ring keeping the decay off. It's not a magic wood, it's someone's will, held steady for centuries, and you can feel how tiring it must be. And the price of it is spelled out plainly. If the 1 is destroyed, the 3 fail too, and everything they've been holding starts moving again. which means every elf helping the quest is knowingly voting to end their own work. Nobody in the Fellowship needs to be told this. Galadriel says it to Frodo more or less directly, and then changes the subject. The 7 went to the dwarves, and they didn't take. Dwarves, it turns out, are the wrong material. They don't fade, they don't go invisible, they don't turn into wraiths. Aula built them stubborn, and stubborn is what they stayed. The rings just made them greedy. Every one of the 7 hordes ends in a disaster of some sort, and the dragons got 4 of the rings, and Sauron recovered the rest, and there's a line where a dwarf lord's ring is taken off him in a dungeon, and it's the last of them, and it's very flat and very sad. And the 9 went to men. And men fade. I don't think you need much detail there. They were kings and sorcerers and warriors. They were given long life and power and everything they'd asked for, and long life without an end to it stretched them out until there was nothing left but appetite and a shape in a cloak. The greatest of them becomes the Witch King, and he spends several centuries in the north methodically destroying Arnos, the northern kingdom, until it simply isn't there anymore. That's why the Rangers exist, incidentally. The whole scruffy business of Aragorn's people wandering the wilderness. They're the remnant of a kingdom that lost. There was a country up there, and now there's a man in a corner of an inn being looked at suspiciously. The last alliance is the last time anybody really pushes back at scale. Elves and men together, Gil-galad and Elendil, 7 years of siege, and at the end of it, the 2 of them go up against Sauron in person, and both of them die doing it. And Isildur cuts the ring off his hand with the broken shard of his father's sword, and it works, and then he keeps it. Elrond was standing right there and told him to throw it in the fire, and he said no. Said it was weregild for his father and his brother, a death price which is a real legal concept in the old northern lore Tolkien lived in, and that he'd take it as his own. 2 years later, he's ambushed at a river, and the ring slips off his finger while he's swimming, and he's shot in the water, and then it lies in the riverbed for 2,500 years. That's the part I keep going back to, not the battle, the gap. An object with that much intent packed into it, sitting in the mud of a river for 25 centuries, while empires up on the bank rise and decline and forget it exists, waiting for somebody to go fishing. One last thing, because people always bring it up. Plenty of readers in the 50s decided the ring was the atom bomb, the terrible weapon that everyone wants and nobody can safely hold. And Tolkien got mildly exasperated about it. He pointed out correctly that if the ring were the bomb, the story would have gone quite differently, because in that version the ring gets used against Sauron and wins. He also pointed out that he'd had the thing on paper long before Hiroshima. What he'd actually been writing about, as far as I can tell, is the desire to keep things the same and what it costs, which is a much stranger idea to build an adventure story on, and rather more uncomfortable. Anyway, that's the Second Age gone, and the kingdom those refugees founded in the south is still standing 3,000 years later, which is impressive, though by then it hasn't had a king in about a millennium. The job title is steward, and originally it meant exactly what it sounds like. Somebody who runs the household while the master's out. It was a court appointment in Gondor, quite a senior one, and at some point it became hereditary in a single family, which was probably a mistake but not an obviously terrible one at the time. And then a king went off to war and didn't come back, and there was nobody to succeed him, and the steward carried on for 969 years. That's the arrangement at the start of the books. Denethor is not a usurper and never claims to be. He's the 26th in a line of men who have each been handed a country and told in effect, look after it, we'll be back. Every single one of them died in the post. Nobody ever came, which is a much more interesting situation than the films have room for, because the tragedy of that family isn't ambition. They've been doing an enormous job under a temporary job title for the better part of a millennium, and everybody keeps reminding them it's temporary. So how do you lose a king that thoroughly? Slowly is the answer, and mostly through bad luck. Gondor started well. It was founded by the survivors out of the drowned island, Isildur and his brother Anarion ruling it jointly in the south, while their father held the north. And for a long stretch it was the most powerful thing in the world. There's a period they call the Height, where the fleets went everywhere. The borders ran far south and east, and a king built a tower and a harbour and had the tribute of half the coast. And then a series of things happened in the wrong order. There was the kin strife, which is the one that really did it. A king married a woman from the north, from the horse people, and their son was of mixed blood, and a faction in the south refused him. So there was a civil war, and it was vicious. And when the losing side was driven out, they didn't disperse. They went to the coast, took the fleets with them, and set themselves up as pirates in the southern havens, which is how Gondor lost its navy, not to an enemy, to a family argument. And those pirates are still raiding 1,000 years later, still nursing the grievance, and are the reason there's a whole detour in the last book about ships coming up the river. Then the plague. Somewhere in the middle of the Third Age, a great pestilence came out of the east and went through everything, and it hit Gondor worse than anywhere. The king died, his children died. The population never recovered. And this is the crucial bit. After the plague, they stopped manning the eastern border properly. The watch on Mordor was abandoned quietly because there weren't enough people, and nobody thought it mattered because there hadn't been anything in Mordor for centuries. That's the moment the whole thing turns. And it isn't a battle. It's a personnel shortage. Then the Wain Riders, waves of them, chewing at the east for generations. Then the loss of Minas Ithil, which is worth pausing on, because it's the single grimmest bit of geography in the book. There were two cities built facing each other across the valley. Minas Ithil in the east, the Tower of the Rising Moon, and Minas Anor in the west, the Tower of the Setting Sun. Sister cities, deliberately named as a pair, one for each brother. The Nazgul took the eastern one, and it stayed standing. It didn't get sacked and burned and left as a ruin. It was occupied, and it's still there, still beautiful in outline, still lit, except the light coming out of it now is wrong. Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery. The stone still glows the way it always did, and everyone within 50 miles wishes it wouldn't. And the western city renames itself Minas Tirith, the Tower of God, because that's all it does now. Two cities built as a matched pair, and one of them has gone bad, and is sitting there in the mountains looking at the other one across the valley for 1,000 years. Nobody can dislodge it, they just live with it in view. The last king rode out to answer a challenge. That's the actual end of the line, and it's almost embarrassing. The Witch King, having taken the city, sent a personal challenge to the King of Gondor, twice, and the second time the king went, against the advice of everyone including his steward, and rode into the valley with an escort and was never seen again. He had no sons. The stewards took over. And then the awkward part, which is that there was a perfectly good claimant available, the northern line, descended from Isildur, still going, up in the wilderness, and Gondor turned him down. On a technicality about descent through the female line, which everyone at the time knew was a pretext. So there was a king. They just didn't want that one. And after that, the standard oath of office is the phrase every steward swears when he takes the white rod, to hold it until the king returns, which each of them says, sincerely, at a ceremony, while both parties present understand perfectly well that no king is coming. Denethor is what happens at the end of 9 centuries of that. He's not stupid and he's not weak, and he's genuinely one of the most capable men of his age. The text says he could read the hearts of other men, and that he had more foresight than anyone alive, except possibly Gandalf. He held the country together for decades against something that should have rolled over it. And he looked into a Palantir, not Saruman's, his own, Gondor had one, legitimately, an heirloom of the house, and he had the right to use it and the strength of will to use it without being taken over. That's the thing everyone forgets. Denethor wrestled Sauron for the stone and did not lose. What happened instead was worse and much cleverer. Sauron couldn't control what Denethor saw, so he controlled what Denethor was shown. Everything true. Every fleet, every muster, every column of soldiers, all of it real, all of it accurate, and none of the other side of the ledger. So a man of enormous integrity spent years looking at nothing but the enemy's strength correctly, and arrived at the perfectly logical conclusion that it was hopeless. He wasn't lied to. He was shown a true picture with the good bits left out, which I'd argue is the single most modern piece of villainy in the entire book. And the thing he does at the end, going down to the tombs, the pyre, all of it is horrible. And it's also, very obviously, Númenórean. That's exactly what the kings of the island did when the fear got hold of them. Enormous stone houses for the dead, and a refusal to lay down life gracefully. Denethor comes from that stock, and he goes out doing the thing his ancestors did when they lost their nerve. The white tree, meanwhile, has been dead the entire time. It's in the court, in the fountain, guarded around the clock by men in black and silver, and it's been a dead stick for generations. Nobody has removed it. The last one died and no seedling came, and they left the corpse of it standing there with a permanent honour guard, waiting. That is the most Gondor thing imaginable, and the closest the book comes to telling you outright what sort of country it is. A people who will post sentries around a dead tree for 200 years because the alternative is admitting it's over. And when Aragorn finally does turn up, there's a sapling found on the mountainside above the city, and it turns out one had been up there all along, growing quietly out of sight, and nobody had gone to look. Right, speaking of that woman from the north who caused the civil war, and the people she came from, the whole of Rohan exists because somebody answered a letter. It's about 500 years before the events of the books. Gondor's in trouble in the northeast, a big invasion coming down, the army out of position, the sort of situation where you lose a province and possibly a country, and the steward at the time sends riders north on the off chance, carrying a request for help to a people nobody in the south had thought about in a long while. 6 riders go, 1 gets through, and the man he reaches is Hjorl, who's young and who's just inherited the leadership of a horse-breeding people living up in the north near the sources of the Anduin, and who owed Gondor nothing whatsoever. He came anyway, rode south with the entire strength of his people, the whole muster, thousands of horsemen, a journey of hundreds of miles at speed, and arrived at a battlefield where the southern army was already broken and being pushed into a river, and hit the enemy from behind. At the moment, it was all going wrong. And afterwards the steward gave him a country, not a payment, not a title, the whole province of Calenardon, which Gondor could no longer populate anyway after the plague, handed over permanently to a people who turned up out of the grass because a message got through. That's the founding of Rohan, and the oath they swore over it is the thing that matters for the rest of the story. Cirion and Hjorl swore friendship in perpetuity. Gondor would come if Rohan called, and Rohan would come if Gondor called, and they swore it on a hill over the tomb of a dead king, and Hjorl swore in his own language, which nobody present understood, and the words were written down phonetically anyway. 500 years later, a red arrow arrives at Edoras, and an old king who's been half asleep for years gets up and rides 4 days across a country to a war that isn't his, because of a promise made on a hill by a man who'd been dead for centuries. I do think that's the emotional engine of the whole Rohan section, and it's why the muster hits the way it does. It's not tactics, it's that somebody once wrote something down and everybody kept it. Now the language business, because it's the most Tolkien thing in the book. The Rohirrim speak Old English, not a made-up language dressed up to look like Old English, actual Old English, the real thing, which Tolkien taught for a living. And the reason isn't laziness, it's the translation conceit again. The idea is that the men of Rohan spoke an older, more archaic version of the same tongue that the hobbits spoke, a worn-down modern form of. So to represent that relationship honestly in an English book, he rendered their speech in the archaic ancestor of English, which means all the names actually mean things. Eomer, Eowyn, Theoden. Theoden is just the Old English word for king, more or less. So the king of Rohan is named king. Eowyn is horse joy. Meduseld, the Golden Hall, means mead hall, which is what it is. The word for their country in their own tongue means the mark, which is what the border territories of Anglo-Saxon England were called. And Mercia's name comes from the same root. He built a people out of a language he already loved, and then wrote them a history to explain the language, which we established at the start is the direction this man always worked in. There's a wrinkle though, and it's a good one. The Rohirrim aren't Anglo-Saxons, they're mounted. They fight from horseback, they live for horses, they're culturally closer to the steppe peoples than to anything in an English shield wall, and Tolkien knew perfectly well that the Anglo-Saxons famously did not fight on horses. He seems to have found that a slightly delicious inversion, the poetry and the hall culture of one people, welded onto the cavalry of another. A commentator once described them as Anglo-Saxons on horseback, and I've never seen a better summary. The horses themselves are worth a minute. There's a breed called the Miaras, the lords of horses, which came out of the west with Yul's ancestors, and which lives as long as a man and understands human speech and won't accept a rider except the king of the mark, or his son. Shadowfax is the last of that line, and the fact that he'll carry Gandalf is a statement about Gandalf that nobody in Rohan quite says out loud. And the whole culture is oriented around the horse in a way that goes past decoration. Their houses are horse-shaped in the roofline. Their songs are about riders. The great grief in their poetry is always the same shape. Where is the horse and the rider? Where is the horn that was blowing? And Tolkien lifted that lament, almost directly, from a real Old English poem, The Wanderer, and gave it to Aragorn to recite at a gate. That's not a homage. That's a professor of Anglo-Saxon quoting his own subject at you and trusting you not to notice. Then there's Theoden, who I think is the most quietly satisfying character arc in the entire book, and it's got nothing to do with magic. The films make his condition a spell, with a possession and a shining exorcism. In the book it's much duller and much worse. There's no enchantment. There's a man in his 70s who's been ill, who lost his son, who has had a clever advisor at his elbow for years telling him he's tired, that it's not worth the effort, that the news is bad, that his nephew is unreliable, that he should sit down. That's all Wormtongue is. He's not a sorcerer. He's a voice next to a chair, applying pressure in the direction the man was already leaning. And after enough years of that, a capable king is a shrunken thing, under a blanket who genuinely believes he can't stand up. And what Gandalf does is heal him in the hall, while Harmer hands him a sword. That's it. There's a bit of theatre with the light and the storm, but the substance of it is that somebody who hasn't been out of doors in a long time is taken out of doors and given something to hold, and his fingers remember it before he does. The text says his grip tightened before his mind caught up. I find that far more moving than a spell being broken, because it's the thing that actually happens to people. And it earns the ending. When he rides out in front of the whole muster at dawn, in front of a city that's already burning, and takes a sword out and strikes the horns until they crack. That's a man who was in a chair 3 weeks earlier. He dies out there, of course, crushed under his own horse after a Nazgul's mount struck it down, in front of his niece. And the last thing he says, roughly, is that he's going to his father's, and even in their mighty company, he won't now be ashamed. Which tells you what he'd actually been frightened of the whole time, and it wasn't dying. And Eowyn, I'll only say this because there's a whole video's worth in it, Her problem isn't that she wants to fight. Her problem is implied by Aragorn. She's been shut in a house, minding an old man she loves who is falling apart, watching everyone she admires ride off, and she's been given a cage and told it's a duty. What she wants isn't glory, it's out. That's why the moment on the field works. Not because a woman kills the Witch King on a technicality about a prophecy, though the technicality is very satisfying, because the person nobody counted as anybody turns out to be standing in exactly the right place. Anyway, Rohan's neighbour up the valley, in the tower with the machinery, is somebody I've been meaning to come back to. The rules they were sent under are quite strict, and almost nobody keeps them. No shows of power, no matching Sauron force for force, no attempting to rule anyone, or to dominate anyone's will, or to gather peoples under themselves. They're there to advise, to encourage, to persuade, and to help the free peoples find their own courage, and that's the entire remit, which is a genuinely odd strategy for dealing with a Dark Lord. And I think it only makes sense if you accept that the Valar had learned something from the last few thousand years. Every time they'd intervened directly, they'd broken the continent. The war that finished Morgoth sank an entire country. So this time round they send 5 people with no army and instructions to be persuasive. They're Maiar, the lesser spirits from the beginning, the same order Melian came from, and Sauron, as it happens, was one too, which is why this is a fair fight in the first place. And the crucial bit is what they're sent in. They're not sent as spirits, they're put into bodies, real ones, that get old, that ache, that need feeding and sleeping, that can be killed. Old men's bodies specifically. From the moment they arrive, they land at the Grey Havens, looking about 70, and they stay looking about 70 for about 2,000 years. The reason for that is stated outright, so that they'd feel the fears and the sorrows, and the weariness of the people they were sent to help. You can't advise someone about endurance if you've never been tired, which I think is a beautiful piece of design, and also explains a great deal about Gandalf, who is famously grumpy in a way no immortal being ought to be. The man's back hurts. There were 5 of them. 2 in blue, 1 brown, 1 grey, 1 white. Saruman came first and came highest. He's the head of the order, and he's the one who was picked for it. He's of Ola's people, a craftsman, a maker of things, which is a lineage you should be twitchy about by now. He's the wise one, the scholar, the one who knows the most, and he takes up residence in a tower in Isengard with the largest library of ring lore anybody's assembled. Gandalf came last and, in the telling, didn't want to come at all. He said he was too weak for it, and that he was afraid of Sauron. And Manwë told him that was precisely the reason he should go. I like that exchange enormously. The one who thought he wasn't up to it is the one who does the job. Radagast turned up brown and dusty and went off into the woods, and according to everyone in the order, failed. That's the official line. He became too fond of the animals and the growing things, forgot what he'd been sent to do, stopped attending to the affairs of people, and essentially went native. Saruman is openly contemptuous about it. Gandalf is fond of him, but Saruman calls him a fool at one point, and describes him as never having been much of a traveller of any kind. And I'll say plainly, I think Radagast's had a rough deal, and I don't entirely accept the verdict, because for one thing, the mission was to protect the free peoples of Middle-earth, and there is nothing in that brief that says the birds and the beasts don't count. The Valar who sent them include the one who made growing things and asked for something to defend them. For another, Radagast's the reason the eagles turn up when they do, more than once, and the reason Gandalf gets a message out when he's locked on a roof. He kept faith with something. He just didn't keep faith with the committee, and of the 5, he's the only one who didn't fail by becoming grand. That has to count for something. Then there are the 2 in blue, and they're my favourite unresolved thing in all of this. Alatar and Palando, in the versions where they're named, and the names change between drafts. they went east, straight off at the start, deep into the parts of the map that were never drawn, and they were never heard from again. Tolkien wrote about them more than once and gave completely different answers each time. In one version, they failed, went east, disappeared into the vast lands out there, and became founders of secret cults and magic traditions among the men of the East, which is to say, they did precisely what they'd been forbidden to do, set themselves up as powers, and are still out there somewhere being worshipped by people who've never heard of Sauron losing. In another version, written later, they did rather well. They went east and spent 2,000 years quietly stirring up rebellion and resistance in the land Sauron drew his armies from, and the reason the forces marching on Gondor at the end weren't twice the size is that 2 old men in blue had been out there for 20 centuries, making a nuisance of themselves. He never picked, and I hope he never meant to, because 2 of them went east and we don't know is a much better fact than either resolution. Gandalf's names are worth a minute, because he collects them. Olorin is the original one, from before he came here. In Valinor he was reckoned the wisest of the Maiar, and he lived in the gardens of Lorien, and, in a detail I adore, he used to go among the elves unseen, and put good ideas and beautiful dreams into their heads, and let them think they'd had them. That's the same man who spends 3 ages getting other people to do things while making it look like their own idea. He hasn't changed his method at all, he's just doing it out loud now. Then Mithrin Dir, which is Sindarin, the Grey Pilgrim, Tharkun to the dwarves, which means something like Staffman, Incarnus in the south, Gandalf in the north, from the Men of the Vales, which is Old Norse and means Wandelf, and it's on a list of dwarf names, in a real medieval poem, which is where Tolkien got it, and Stormcrow, when somebody's annoyed with him, which is often. One person refracted through many different cultures who each got a different piece of him. Nobody in the story has all the names except him, and Saruman doesn't share any of Gandalf's names. Saruman's the tragedy of the 5, and the way it happens is very ordinary. He starts studying the enemy, properly, seriously, in enormous depth, because you can't defeat what you don't understand, and someone has to do the work. He reads everything about the rings, he learns the craft, he builds an organisation and a colour-coded hierarchy and a research programme, and somewhere in the middle of all that, he stops studying Sauron in order to beat him, and starts studying him in order to be him. The tells are all small. He starts calling himself Saruman of many colours. He starts talking about order and knowledge and rule as if they're the same word. He starts describing the sacrifice of a few small things for the greater plan. He takes up with a Palantir, one of Feanor's stones, still working after all this time because he thinks he can look through it safely, being clever, and of course there's someone on the other end who's been waiting for a clever person to try that. And by the end, he's got a tower full of machinery, he's cut down every tree for miles because he needs furnaces, and he is functionally a smaller copy of the thing he was sent to stop. Not seduced by evil, bored by patience. There's a line where Gandalf says he's become a fool, and it's not a taunt, it's a diagnosis. He had all the knowledge and none of the sense, and the difference between them is the whole point of the Order. One last thing, since it connects everything. The reason the hobbits get pulled into any of this at all is Gandalf, doing what Olorin always did. He'd been worried for a long time about the dragon in the north, not because of the treasure, but because a dragon of that size, available to Sauron at the wrong moment, would have opened the whole north, and he happened to meet a dwarf on the road who wanted his family's mountain back, and he'd been keeping half an eye on the Shire for years, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. He put a burglar and a dwarf together, on a hunch, and by his own admission, he wasn't at all sure why. Which brings us eventually round to the small people, who he did plan, and who Tolkien did too. Here's a problem you don't think about until you try to write one of these. Everyone in the Legendarium is enormous. Not physically in importance. They're kings, or the children of kings, or people carrying a doom, or immortals with 4,000 years of grief behind their eyes. Every single character walks into a room already weighed down with lineage. And that's fine for a mythology. Mythologies run on that. But you cannot follow those people through a long book at close range, because there's no one in the story whose problems are the size of yours. Which is, I think, the actual reason hobbits work. They're the only people in Middle-earth with a normal appetite. So, where do they come from? They don't. That's the honest answer, and it's one of my favourite things about them. Hobbits have no creation story. The elves were sung awake in a design. Men were part of the third theme. Dwarves were made in a workshop and had a proper conversation with God about it. Hobbits just turn up in the records, already there, somewhere in the Vales of the Anduin, in the early Third Age. The text says they're related to men. It doesn't say how, and there's a line in the prologue about how they'd forgotten their own origins entirely by the time anybody was writing things down, because they'd stopped being interested in the past around the same time they started being interested in lunch. Tolkien could have fixed that. He fixed everything else. He didn't, and I suspect he didn't want to, because a hobbit with a mythic origin isn't a hobbit anymore. There are 3 sorts originally, and they're worth knowing because it explains rather a lot. The Harfoots are the standard ones, small brown hill dwellers, the ones who actually live in holes, the most numerous by a distance. If you picture a hobbit, that's a Harfoot. The Stores are broader and heavier. They lived in the flatlands by the rivers, and this is the odd one. They were the only hobbits who liked water. They swam. They used boats, and there the branch Smeagol came from, which explains an enormous amount about how a hobbit ended up fishing in a river in the first place. And the Falahides are the tall, thin, fair ones from the woods in the north, and they were fewer than the others, and they were the ones with a taste for trees and for languages and for going somewhere. They tended to end up leading. And the 2 great hobbit families that produce all the trouble, the Tooks and the Brandybucks, are heavily Falahide. Bilbo's mother was a Took. Frodo's mother was a Brandybuck. Every hobbit in this story who does something inexplicable has an ancestor who was constitutionally unable to stay in. The Shire itself is a joke, and a very carefully constructed one. Technically, it's part of a kingdom. The hobbits were granted the land by a king at Fornost, on the condition that they keep the bridges in repair and speed the king's messengers and acknowledge his lordship. And they agreed, and they've been keeping the bridges in repair ever since. There hasn't been a king for about 1,000 years. Nobody's told them exactly. They know in the way you know a distant historical fact. But the arrangement simply carried on without the other party, and they kept sending a token force to a war that stopped happening, and they still date documents from a system that outlasted the government that invented it. Their actual government is beautiful. There's a mayor elected every 7 years whose duties are almost entirely presiding at dinners. He's also technically postmaster and first constable, and Tolkien notes dryly that the only 2 branches of the service with any real work in them are the post and the watch, and that the watch mostly deals with stray livestock. There's a Tyne, which is a hereditary title held by the head of the Took family, and it's the office of the master of the Shire Moot and the captain of a militia. But since there's been no moot and no militia in living memory, it's an honour and nothing else. And there's a master of Buckland over the river, who's regarded as slightly foreign for living on the wrong bank. So, a country run by a dinner host, a hereditary officer with no duties, and a postal service that does the heavy lifting. That's the arrangement that keeps 1,000 years of peace going while everything else in the world falls apart. And I don't think Tolkien is being entirely satirical about it. There's real affection there. The calendar, of course, he did properly. 12 months of 30 days each, every month the same length, so every date falls on the same weekday every year, which is the sort of thing that makes an accountant weep with joy. That's 360 days. So there are extra days outside the months to make up the difference. 3 at midsummer, called the Lithe days, and 2 at midwinter, the Yule days. And those days don't belong to any month at all. And mid-year's day, and overlithe in leap years, don't have a weekday. Mid-year's day is nobody's day. It sits between June and July and belongs to nothing. And in leap years there's a second one, the Overlithe, which comes around every 4 years and is apparently a day of tremendous festivity. He worked out the year Bilbo's party fell on and cross-referenced it and made it consistent across the whole book. Nobody needed that. He did it anyway. We covered why earlier. The loose ends annoyed him. Pipeweed is where he gets properly cheeky. It's tobacco. It is straightforwardly tobacco, in a world that has no America, and he knows that's a problem. So he addresses it in the prologue with an entirely straight face. The herb is not native. It came north from the south, and it's supposed to have been brought over the sea by the men of Westerness. So the joke is that the Hobbit's greatest cultural contribution, because it is, they claim the invention of smoking it in pipes as the one and only thing hobbits ever gave the world, arrived on a refugee ship from a drowned civilization. Long bottom leaf grows in the South Farthing thanks to Numenor. And the varieties have names. Long bottom leaf, Old Toby, Southern Star. Old Toby's named after the hobbit who first grew it. That's the level we're operating at. The translation business I mentioned back at the start sits underneath all of this. The conceit is that hobbits called themselves something like Kuduk, and men in the north had an old word for hole dweller, and Tolkien's rendered the relationship between the two words into English as best he can, which is why the language of the Shire feels homely, and the language of Rohan feels archaic, not because Rohan is posher, but because their tongue stands in the same relation to Western as Old English does to modern English. It's a translator's decision, executed consistently across 1,000 pages for readers who will mostly never notice. And there's the old Took, who I always come back to, Gerontius Took, who lived to 130 and had 12 children and was, for a long time, the oldest hobbit on record. Bilbo passes him eventually, which the Shire finds mildly unsettling, and there's a moment in the party where somebody does the arithmetic and it hangs there. That's the loveliest bit of horror in the book, honestly. Not a monster, a community noticing that a well-liked neighbour has stopped aging on schedule and deciding, collectively, not to raise it. Because that's the other thing the hobbits are for, and I'll say it once. Everyone else in this world knows what they're inside. The elves know the history, Aragorn knows the lineage, Gandalf knows the whole shape of it from before the world was made. The hobbits don't know any of it. They're in a story about the end of an age, and they think they're in a story about getting home for dinner. And the reason the ending works is that somebody who never once understood the scale of it carried the thing anyway. And there's one more hobbit worth talking about, from the branch that liked boats, who went a very different way with all of that. He had a birthday. That's the detail I can never get past. The whole thing starts on a birthday, in a boat, on a river, in reasonable weather, with 2 cousins fishing. Because Smeagol was a hobbit. Not a hobbit exactly. One of the river folk, the Sturish branch I mentioned, the ones who liked water and boats and swimming, and lived on the banks of the Anduin in the wide green country. They were a small, quiet people with grandmothers and family arrangements and, from the sound of it, a fairly matriarchal setup. Because the one member of that community we hear anything about is his grandmother, who was the head of the family and who eventually threw him out. And on his birthday, his cousin Deagol was pulled out of the boat by a fish and came up out of the mud with a gold ring in his hand. The ring had been down there for 2,500 years, in the riverbed, since a man was shot in the water not far upstream. It had been waiting, and I use the word deliberately, because Gandalf uses it too. The thing was looking for a way back, and it had abandoned Isildur on purpose. And it did the same thing again later, and it had picked its moment. Smeagol asked for it as a birthday present, which is almost funny. Deagol said no, reasonably, since he'd found it, and Smeagol strangled him on the riverbank and took it and hid the body. That's the first murder Smeagol commits, and it happens within about 4 minutes of it coming out of the water, between 2 relatives, over a present. What follows is the most detailed portrait of addiction anyone wrote in a fantasy novel in the 1950s, and it's clinical. he starts using it to eavesdrop. Invisible, going about the village, learning things about people that he shouldn't and using them badly, small nastiness, gossip, spite, then theft. He becomes unbearable to live with. People start kicking him whenever he appears, which is where the name comes from, because of the swallowing noise he made in his throat. And eventually, his grandmother, who is the head of the family and has clearly had enough, expels him from the hole. And no one goes with him. He goes up into the mountains, and into them. And here's the number that I think about more than any other in this book. He was under that mountain for 478 years. Not in a hurry, not on a mission. 478 years in a tunnel by a cold lake with no light, eating fish raw and the occasional goblin, talking to himself because there was nobody else, with a small gold ring keeping him alive well past any span a hobbit was built for. The ring doesn't extend life as a kindness, it stretches it. He wasn't getting older in a healthy way, he was being drawn out thin, and by the end of it, he'd forgotten the taste of bread and the sound of trees and what the wind was like, and he'd built up an entire second conversational partner out of his own loneliness, because a person alone for 5 centuries has to talk to somebody. He kept a few things though, and one of them is genuinely strange. He kept the riddles. When Bilbo turns up in the dark, what happens isn't a fight, it's a riddle game, played under formal rules that both of them recognise, because the riddle game is ancient and sacred, and you don't cheat at it. And half of Gollum's riddles are about the things he can still remember, and half are about darkness and eating. And Bilbo wins by asking what's in his pocket, which isn't a riddle at all, and everybody in the scene knows it isn't, and Gollum lets it stand because he's playing by rules that are older than his own ruin. There's a whole essay in that. A creature that murdered his cousin on a riverbank still won't break the etiquette of a game. The other thing he kept was Smeagol. That's the part I find hardest, because he isn't gone. There are 2 of him, and Tolkien is quite careful about it. Sam calls them Slinker and Stinker, which is a wonderfully hobbitish way of putting something clinical, and the 2 voices argue out loud, and one of them is the Rings creature, and the other is a small frightened person from a riverbank who has been buried under it for centuries and is still in there. And the second one nearly gets out. This is the moment I'd point anybody to if they've only seen the films, because it's not really in them. On the stairs, late in the second book, Frodo is asleep, Frodo's head in Sam's lap, and Gollum comes back from wherever he'd been and finds them like that, and stops, and the text says that for a moment, if either of them had woken, they'd have seen an old, tired, starved, pitiable thing, and that he reached out and touched Frodo's knee, almost a caress, and Tolkien says that, at that instant, he was an old hobbit, and nothing more. And then Sam wakes up and, understandably, snaps at him, calls him a sneak, and the moment shuts permanently, and everything after that follows from it. Tolkien wrote in a letter that, if Sam hadn't spoken, Gollum's repentance might have held. That the whole thing turned there, on a tired man being short with someone he had every reason to distrust, which is a horrible thing to build into a book. The one honest chance the creature gets, and it's missed for entirely understandable reasons by the most decent person in the story. And then the ending, which is the piece of engineering the whole thing was built for. Frodo fails. That has to be said plainly, because people still misremember it. He gets to the crack in the mountain, having carried the thing across a continent at enormous cost, and he stands there and says he will not do it, and puts it on. That's not a flaw in the plot. That's the point being made. Nobody could have done it. The task was impossible by design, and everyone who knew anything knew that. And the whole plan was to get it there and hope. And what saves the world is that 2 people spared Gollum's life when it would have been much easier not to. Bilbo in the tunnel, who had a sword and a clear shot at an invisible advantage, and felt a sudden understanding of what 500 years alone must have been like, and stepped over him instead. And Frodo, later, who was told plainly by Gandalf that many who live deserve death, and some who die deserve life, and asked whether he could hand it out, and who kept the creature alive across the whole journey against everyone's advice, including his own better judgment. And the thing that ends the war is Gollum biting a finger off and falling in by accident while dancing. So it's pity that does it. Not courage, not strength, not the fellowship. Two separate acts of mercy, performed decades apart by people who got nothing for them. Tolkien mentioned in a letter that this was the thing the ending was arranged around, which is a very odd foundation for an adventure story, and I've never quite got over it. Anyway, since we're on the subject of things the man never quite explained, Tolkien had a grudge against Macbeth, not the play generally. One specific thing in the play, which is the bit where the witches promise Macbeth he's safe until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, and everyone in the audience thinks, oh good, our forest is going to walk, and then it turns out to be soldiers carrying branches as camouflage. He read that as a boy and felt cheated, and he said so decades later in a letter. He'd wanted the trees to actually come. He described writing the Ents partly out of a bitter disappointment with that, which is possibly the pettiest and most productive literary grudge on record. So he wrote the version where the trees actually come, and he made it work by going back to the beginning for it. Because the Ents aren't an invention bolted on. They come out of that conversation between Auli and Yavanna I mentioned earlier, her point being that a world full of gifted craftsmen with hammers is going to be a world where somebody looks at a forest and sees material. And the answer she gets, essentially, is that when the children wake, the thought of her will wake too, and there will be shepherds for the trees. Which means Ents are as old as the elves. Treebeard says it outright, and he's not exaggerating. He says he was in these woods before the seas were bent, and before Beleriand went under, and he means it literally. He's the oldest living thing in Middle-earth, not the most powerful. The oldest. Gandalf says so, and he's in a position to know. The Entish language is where Tolkien lets himself have real fun. It's slow. Enormously, unmanageably slow. Long vowels, repetitions, a sound Tolkien describes as full of subtle shades of vowel that even the elves couldn't reproduce, and nothing in it is short. And the rule is that you don't say anything in Entish unless it's worth taking a long time to say, which produces the joke that everybody remembers. Treebeard won't tell them his real name because names in Entish are stories, and his has been getting longer his whole life, and he's been alive since before the coast was where it is. But the consequence people miss is the good one. There are no lies in Entish, not because Enters are morally superior, but because it takes so long to say anything that a lie would be an enormous amount of work for a very small return. You'd be at it for hours. The language is honest for logistical reasons, and they're slow in the head as well, deliberately, and it's not stupidity. It's that they don't consider a question answered until they've genuinely finished thinking about it, and thinking takes as long as it takes. The Entmoot runs for 3 days, and the hobbits are climbing the walls, and from the inside 3 days is quite brisk for a decision of that size. Then there's the thing they've lost. The Entwives are not there. And it's not a mystery in the sense of a puzzle with a solution. It's a straightforward, sad account of two groups of people wanting incompatible things. The Ents loved the wildwood, trees growing where they liked, in no order, nothing tended. And the Entwives loved order, the lesser things, the fruit trees and the grasses and the herbs, laid out properly, tended and coaxed and improved. They wanted gardens, so they drifted. Not in a row, they simply spent less time in the same places, and then the Entwives crossed the river and made gardens on the far side, and the men who lived there learned farming from them and thought highly of them. And when the Ents finally went over to look for them, after a long time, the whole country had been laid waste in one of Sauron's wars, burned, the gardens gone, and nobody was there. They've been looking ever since. There are Ent songs about it, and there's a bit in the marching song where the male and female voices sing separate verses that only come together at the end in a hoped-for future. And Treebeard says the Entwives never actually agreed to that ending, the Ents put it in themselves. That's a devastating detail, and it's delivered as a footnote about a song. And because there are no Entwives, there are no Entings, no young ones, not for thousands of years. The Ents are a species that has quietly stopped, and Treebeard mentions it without much fuss, which somehow makes it worse. Tolkien was asked whether they were still alive somewhere, and he wouldn't say. Some of his notes lean towards them being gone entirely. He never wrote it down as fact. Which brings me to the bloke in the blue coat. Tom Bombadil turns up in the first book, in the Old Forest, and he is completely unlike anything else in the entire legendarium. And the reason for that is quite mundane. He was invented independently, and only later placed into Middle-earth. He was a doll belonging to Tolkien's son Michael. He'd been the subject of a poem in a magazine years before The Lord of the Rings started. And when Tolkien needed something in the Old Forest, he simply put him in. And then he had to live with the consequences, and he chose not to fix it. What the text actually establishes, and I'll stick to only that. He calls himself eldest, and says he was there before the river and the trees, before the first raindrop and the first acorn, and that he knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless. Tom Bombadil, asked who he is, says he is. He's got no interest whatsoever in the war and doesn't consider himself a party to it. He has power inside his own borders and none outside them, and the ring doesn't work on him. He puts it on and doesn't vanish. He makes it vanish instead, briefly, as a party trick, and hands it back, and the whole scene is played as a bit of fun by everyone except the reader, who's just watched the most dangerous object in the world get treated like a coin behind somebody's ear. At the Council of Elrond, they discuss giving him the ring to look after, and they decide against it. Not because he'd be corrupted, but because he wouldn't take it seriously. He'd put it down somewhere and forget where. He doesn't have the kind of mind that understands why it matters, and if everything else fell, he'd fall last and alone. The theories briefly and neutrally. He's Eru walking about in person. He's a Vala nobody named. He's a Maya. He's the spirit of the countryside of Oxfordshire and Berkshire, which Tolkien did say once in a letter, though he said it about the character in the poem. He's a deliberate gap. Tolkien himself battered it away. He wrote that some things ought to remain mysterious in any narrative, and that Bombadil was one of them, and I've come round to thinking that's not evasion, it's a choice. In a book obsessed with genealogy, where every sword has a name and every hill has 3, there's one figure standing in a wood who won't be filed, and the story is better for it. He's not the only blank either. There's the east and the south. There are lands out there and peoples in them, and the maps just stop. Tolkien knew roughly what was there and wrote almost none of it, and the effect is that Middle-earth has an outside. There's the cats of Queen Beruthiel, which is the funniest example of this. Aragorn makes a passing reference to them in Moria in a single clause, as though everyone knows the story. Nobody does because there wasn't one. Tolkien invented the reference, and only much later, when people wouldn't stop asking, wrote a rough account of a joyless queen in Gondor with 9 black cats and a white one that she used to spy on the city. He never published it properly. And there's what happened to the 2 in blue, which I'll leave where I left it. I've come round to liking the blanks more than the answers, for reasons I'll get to, though there's one blank that genuinely troubled him, and he spent about 40 years failing to fill it in. There's a question in this world that Tolkien could not answer, and it bothered him for about 40 years, and he left behind at least 4 incompatible attempts at it. Where do orcs come from? The problem is theological, and it's a problem he made for himself with the very first thing he wrote, because at the beginning, in the music, it's established that only Eru can make something that's genuinely alive. That's the whole point of the Orla business under the mountain. Making is not something the enemy can do. Melkor never invented anything. He only ever spoiled things that already existed. So there cannot be a species of evil creature that was simply created evil. That's ruled out by the rules on page 1, which leaves him needing an origin for an entire people who do nothing but serve the dark, in a world where nobody starts out that way. His first answer, the one that made it into the published Silmarillion, is the grimmest available. The orcs are elves, specifically the ones taken at the very beginning, those elves who were snatched near the water when they first woke, before anyone had come to help, brought to Morgoth's fortress, and worked on, over a very long time, by slow arts of cruelty, until their descendants were what we see. Ruined elves, essentially, and the ruin is heritable. Which means every orc killed cheerfully in a battle scene is descended from someone who woke up under those stars and looked at the water. That's an appalling idea, and I think he knew it was appalling, which is possibly why he kept trying to replace it. Later on, in the notes, he tries men instead, orcs as corrupted humans, which fixes the timing problems, because there are orcs around before some of the elf capture chronology quite works. He tries a version where they're beasts, given the crude semblance of speech, essentially animals puppeted into shape, which would solve the moral problem entirely, and which he seems to have liked for a while. He tries a version where they're largely mindless and run on the will of whoever's directing them, which explains a real thing in the text, that orc armies collapse completely the moment the Dark Lord falls, in a way that soldiers don't. And he tries a mixture, which is probably the truest to how he actually left it. Some of each, over thousands of years, with corrupted mire in the leadership, which is where the ones with names and personalities come from. He never settled. He was still writing essays about it in the last decade of his life, going back and forth, and none of it was published in his lifetime because none of it was finished. And what makes it more than a bookkeeping issue is this. He'd written the orcs, in the actual books, as people. That's what surprises people going back. Every time you get an orc conversation with nobody important listening, they sound like disgruntled soldiers. They complain about the food, they complain about their officers. 2 of them in Mordor have a whole exchange about how they'd like to clear off and set up somewhere quiet with a few lads and no big bosses. And one of them says the war's not going well and the other tells him to shut up before someone hears. That's not the voice of a beast. That's a bloke in a trench, and I don't think it's an accident which war the man had been in. He also has characters in the book state, more than once, that orcs cannot be redeemed and must simply be destroyed. And then he goes home and writes anguished private notes, wondering whether that's actually defensible in a world he'd designed to make it indefensible. Honestly, I think the unresolved version is the most interesting one available, and I'd rather have his 40 years of discomfort than a clean answer. Right, a couple of the other things he left loose, since we're here. Dragons, where they come from is never properly explained either. Beyond that, Morgoth bred them, which raises the same objection. The first is Glaurung, who has no wings, which surprises people. The winged ones come later, as a development, and Tolkien clearly thought of the wingless kind as the older and more serious model. What's consistent is the psychology, and he got that from the old northern literature and improved it. A dragon isn't a big lizard. A dragon is a mind. It hoards, and the hoarding is a kind of illness, and it can lie down on a heap of gold for 2 centuries and know if a single cup is missing. And they talk, and talking to one is the dangerous part. Smaug's conversation with Bilbo is a masterclass in it. The dragon is flattering, curious, apparently good-humoured, and the entire time he's extracting information and planting doubt. And Bilbo comes out of the tunnel having accidentally told him things, and having started to wonder whether the dwarves intend to pay him. That's a dragon spell, and it's just conversation. Then the eagles, who take a lot of criticism. Everybody's heard the joke about why they didn't just fly the ring to the mountain, and there are 2 answers to it, and only one gets said much. The practical one is that a slow-flying object over Mordor, in full view of the fortress that exists specifically to watch the sky, is not a plan, It's a delivery service. The better answer is that the eagles aren't transport. They're the servants of Manwe, they're his eyes, and they intervene rarely, and on their own terms, and never because somebody asked nicely. They turn up when they turn up. Tolkien wrote in a letter that he'd been careful not to overuse them precisely because they're a dangerous device. His phrase for that sort of thing was a machine, in the old theatrical sense, and he thought it cheapened a story to lean on one. So the eagles are deliberately rationed, which is a craft decision dressed up as a plot rule, and I think it's the correct one. And then there's the Cats of Queen Beruthiel, which I mentioned earlier, and which is my favourite example of the whole habit, a reference dropped into one sentence, with total confidence, for a story that didn't exist, because a world where every reference has a story behind it doesn't feel like a real world. Real worlds are full of things people half remember. The Watcher in the water outside Moria is another. That thing in the pool with the tentacles which grabs the door and then seals the entrance behind them is never identified. Not a name, not a species, not a word about where it came from. Gandalf says something crept out of the dark water and that there are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places. And that's your lot. Nobody ever goes back to check. And the nameless things from the same conversation, which is possibly the single most alarming aside in the book. Gandalf, describing what he found after the Balrog fight, mentions that far below the deepest delving of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things older than Sauron, and that he won't say any more about it because it would darken the light of day. Older than Sauron. Not made by Morgoth, apparently. Not accounted for anywhere in the music that we're told about. He drops that in one paragraph, in a conversation between two characters going up a staircase, and never returns to it for the rest of his life. That's the trick, the whole trick, and it's why the place feels the size it does. The map has edges, but the world doesn't. Anyway. Now the part almost nobody talks about, which is what everybody actually did afterwards. At the back of The Lord of the Rings, there are about 130 pages of appendices, and most people skip them, and I understand why. They look like homework. Family trees, king lists, calendars, a pronunciation guide, a table of runes, and buried in there, in the driest possible format, is the saddest material in the entire book. Because the appendices tell you what happened to everyone, not in scenes, in dates and one-line entries, the way an annal would, and the flatness of it is what does the damage. Aragorn reigns for 122 years, which is a long and, by all accounts, extremely good reign. The kingdom's reunited, the borders hold, the tree grows in the court again. He and Arwen have a son and daughters. It's the happy ending, delivered in full. And then he gets old, in the Númenórean way, and he still has the old right that the kings of the island had before it went wrong. He can lay down his life, voluntarily, at the time of his choosing, rather than hanging on and going to pieces. So he does. He goes to the house of the kings, and he lies down, and he says goodbye to his wife, and the annal gives way for about 2 pages. Arwen asks him to stay, just a little longer. She's an elf who chose mortality, the same choice Luthien made, and for the same reason, and she made it a long time ago in a garden with the whole thing explained to her, and now it's arrived and she can't do it. She says she hadn't understood, that the doom of men seemed bitter to her now she'd come to it, and he says the thing that's always struck me as the truest line he ever gets, that they are not bound forever to the circles of the world, and beyond them there is more than memory. And then he says, in effect, let us not be beaten. And he dies, and the text says that in his death the grace of his youth and the wisdom of his age were all blended together, and that he was beautiful lying there. And then Arwen goes north. She leaves the city, she gives up the kingdom, and she goes alone to Lothlórien, which is empty by now, because Galadriel's gone west and the people have left, and the ring that held the place has failed. So the wood is just a wood. The trees are still there, the grass is still there, and there's nobody in it. She lies down on the hill at Seir in Amroth, where she'd been happy once, and dies there in the winter, and the text says the green grass came again over her when the world was changed, and that there is her grave until the world is changed. That's in an appendix, behind a family tree. The rest of it is quieter, but it's all in the same register. Sam goes home and gets on with it, which is exactly right for him. He marries Rose, he has 13 children, he's elected mayor of the Shire 7 times, which is 49 years of presiding at dinners and running the post. He plants the tree in the party field, with the dust Galadriel gave him, and the Shire has the best year in living memory afterwards. And he keeps the red book that Frodo left him, and passes it on. And then Rose dies when he's very old, and he goes to his daughter and gives her the book, and rides out west and takes ship at the Grey Havens, because he was a ring-bearer too, briefly, and the passage was allowed to him. Which means an old gardener from a village in the West Country was, as far as any record goes, the last person to cross that sea. Merry and Pippin both did well, Master of Buckland and Tane, respectively, both of them titled, both of them a few inches taller than everyone else, for the rest of their lives because of a drink they had in a forest. And when they were very old, they handed things over, rode south to Rohan and then to Gondor, and died there, and they were laid among the great in the city, and afterwards, when Aragorn died, moved to lie beside him. 2 hobbits, buried in a royal tomb, having gone abroad in old age because they wanted to see Rohan and Gondor again, and Legolas built a ship. He waited until Aragorn died. That's the detail. He'd seen the sea by then, and had the sea longing on him for years, and hadn't gone, because there was a man he'd promised things to, and when the man was gone, he built a grey ship in Ithilien, and sailed down the river and away, and the tradition says he took Gimli with him, which shouldn't have been possible. No dwarf had ever gone. There's no provision for it, and dwarves aren't part of that arrangement at all, and the whole thing rests on Galadriel, apparently asking for permission on his behalf. The text is careful about it. It says that this is said, and that if it's true, then it was for love of Galadriel, and because he was the greatest friend of an elf. Which is a slightly awkward footnote, technically, and I don't care in the slightest. Aula's most stubborn people produced exactly one man who got to see the West, and it happened because he made a friend. The elves leaving isn't presented as a disaster either, and I think that's worth saying, because it's easy to read it that way. The 3 fail because the one is gone, and everything that had been held still starts moving again, and the woods become ordinary woods, and the halls become old buildings. That's what winning looked like. The world becoming an ordinary place where things change and grow and get worn out, run by short-lived people with no particular powers, is the victory condition. Middle-earth turns into somewhere much more like here. The magic doesn't get defeated, it retires. And then the same thing happens outside the book, which is the part I find genuinely strange. Tolkien died in 1973. He'd been working on the mythology for the better part of 60 years, and he hadn't finished it. Hadn't come close, in fact, because he kept revising foundations rather than writing endings, and by the end, there were multiple incompatible versions of the same events written decades apart in different handwriting on the backs of examination papers and college note paper. And his 3rd son, Christopher, who'd been reading drafts of this stuff since he was a boy and had drawn the maps, took the boxes home and spent the rest of his life on it. The Silmarillion came out in 1977, 4 years after his father died, and it's an assembled thing. Christopher had to choose between versions, stitch across gaps, and in a few places write connective material himself. And he was quite open about the fact that a different editor would have produced a different book. He clearly wasn't at peace with that, because he then spent the next 20-odd years publishing the workings. All of it. The history of Middle-earth ran to 12 volumes, and it's not a story, it's the evidence, every draft in order, with the changes tracked and annotated, so that anyone who wanted to could see exactly what he'd done and disagree with him. 12 volumes of a man showing his work on his father's unfinished project. Across his time as literary executor, he brought out somewhere in the region of 24 books out of those manuscripts. And it still hasn't stopped, which I find quietly astonishing. In 2024, they published about 250 of Tolkien's poems collected together for the first time, 3 volumes of them. And in 2025 out came a thing called the Bovadium Fragments, edited by Christopher years before his own death, a short satire nobody had read, written in the late 50s and early 60s, about a city being slowly destroyed by motor cars. Not Middle-earth at all, just an Oxford professor being cross about traffic, in Latin-flavoured joke names with his own illustrations, 50-odd years after the man died, and there's still new material coming out of the boxes. A story about a world where the magic drains away and the age ends, and everything beautiful goes west, and the paperwork is still arriving. There's a thing I didn't get to tonight, and it's been bothering me the whole way through. Gondolin, the hidden city in the mountains, built in a ring of stone with a secret way in, and it stood for 400 years, and few outside knew where it was. And then it fell in a single day, and the escape route out of it is one of the best sequences Tolkien ever wrote. And it was also the very first thing he ever wrote about this world, in that same hospital notebook before any of the rest of it existed. I skipped it entirely. It didn't fit anywhere, and every time I tried to squeeze it in, it wanted more room than I had. So that's probably a separate one, some other time. The Palantiri as well, actually. 7 stones, made by the same man who made the jewels, scattered across 2 kingdoms, and by the time of the books, most of them are lost or in the wrong hands, or sitting at the bottom of the sea, and there's at least one that nobody ever accounts for. That's the trouble with this. You pull one thread out to look at it, and there are 4 more attached to it, and Tolkien had 60 years, and I've got a couple of hours. Anyway, if you're still awake, I'm slightly impressed. If you're not, that's rather the point, and none of this was going anywhere in particular. I'll leave you with the one that stayed with me longest, not a battle. It's Sam in the dark, sitting on a rock in a country with nothing growing in it, looking up and seeing a single star through a gap in the clouds, and the thought that gets him up off the rock is that the shadow is only a small and passing thing, and there's light and beauty out there beyond its reach, forever. He doesn't know that the star is a jewel on a ship. He doesn't know any of the rest of it. He just looks up